Episode 26, Part 13, Chapter 24. Chapter 24. They arrived at Cosmo Canyon within the hour. The landscape surrounding the area was too rough and rugged for the high wind to land, so they were forced to make their landing on the plains just outside of the cliffs and walk the rest of the way. There was one awkward moment during the flight when the high wind flew over the Nebel Plains. Cloud and Tifa had looked out of the window and watched in silence as Nibelheim passed by beneath them. Though both were born and raised in that town, it no longer felt like home. Not now they knew all of its dark secrets. Cloud had spent some time looking down at Shinra Manor. From above it looked like any other mansion. But beneath its creaking floorboards was the manor's true secret, another of Professor Hojo's secret labs. It was there that Hojo had tested on the injured Cloud and Zack following Sephiroth's defeat at the reactor. Sensing his discomfort, Tifa had placed her hand on his shoulder, smiling warmly. Once in Cosmo Canyon, Red 13 bounded swiftly up the slope and stopped outside the main building. It had been so long since he had been home that he was filled with excitement that his tail showed keenly, swishing back and forth. The hound barked, urging them to hurry up. Barrett and the others were too exhausted after their trek through the cliffs to continue for now, so Cloud and Tifa left them outside to rest while they followed Red 13 up to Bugenhagen's room. They took the 3 pieces of huge material with them, carrying it in a large bag. They found Bugenhagen waiting in his planetary display room. The old man must have known that they were coming, for he started speaking the moment they entered the room, even though he had his back to them.
Ho ho ho! If you are ever in need of my wisdom, you are always welcome here.
The old man turned and smiled broadly, his old face creasing.
Yeah, that's why we came,
said Cloud, squeezing past Red 13 and making his way towards the old man. Bugenhagen folded his hands behind his back and looked up at the blank dome hanging over them. He did not need the added effect of holographic planets to project the images his mind's eye could see.
What to do? Have you lost your way? When that happens, we each have to take a good, long look at ourselves.
He took his eyes off the dome and fixed his gaze on the 3 in front of him, looking at each in turn.
There's always something in the deepest reaches of our hearts. Something buried or forgotten. Remember it.
He urged them.
Whatever that is, must certainly be what you are all looking for. That's easy enough to say,
Cloud muttered, running a hand through his hair,
but I can't remember a thing.
Bugenhagen looked at him closely, his expression unreadable.
It must be there,
he insisted.
Look harder.
Tifa's brow creased as she thought hard, but nothing came to her.
No good,
she said, shaking her head.
Cloud, let's have the others come.
Cloud nodded and pulled out the PHS from his pocket. He was surprised the device had lasted as long as it had, after being thrown about, dropped into the life stream, and even sent up into space. Yet it did still work, and so after a brief word with Barrett, he placed the device back into his pocket and waited for the others to arrive. Barrett and the others arrived a few minutes later. Once Cloud finished telling them what it was they had to do, they piled into the room and began to think. While they were thinking, Bugenhagen watched them closely, waiting for them to remember.
Do you see it?
The old man asked, breaking the silence.
What is it that you are searching for?
There was another long silence. Cat shook his head.
Nope. Not a thing.
He said. He crossed his legs and drummed his fingers against his megaphone. Then he rubbed his chin and tugged his whiskers, as though changing actions would help him to remember. The cat sighed.
Nah,
he said finally.
Can't come up with a thing. Me either,
said Yuffie loudly, as she rapped her knuckles against her head.
I don't get any of this.
Cloud hesitated before answering.
I remember Eris a lot,
he said. He then frowned and looked at the ground.
No, not that.
He corrected himself.
You haven't remembered. You haven't forgotten. That's not it. How would you say it?
The swordsman tapped his foot against the floor as he tried to sort through his thoughts. No matter where he started, all lines of thought eventually led him to Eris. Her smiling face was always there in the back of his mind. Smiling. Eris was always smiling, always cheerful. No matter what the situation was, no matter how grim things became, Eris was always there to lift everyone's spirits. He remembered their first meeting, that fateful morning when he had crashed through the church roof in Sector 5. The first thing he had seen when he opened his eyes was her face smiling down at him. He remembered the destruction of Sector 7. Eris had been with Tseng on his helicopter, about to be taken away for Hojo's human experiments. She had smiled then, after assuring them that little Marlene had managed to make it to safety. He remembered their date in the gold saucer. Eris had smiled the most that night, thoroughly enjoying the time she had spent with him that night. He could clearly remember those moments in the gondola, going around the theme park, watching as the fireworks lit up the night sky. It was during that gondola ride that Eris had turned to him and said, "I want to meet you." At the time, Cloud had found those words confusing. Now that he knew the truth about himself, he had to wonder, did Eris have a feeling all along? Lastly, he remembered Eris's last moments on that podium in the Forgotten City. She had smiled then, too, right before Sephiroth had descended and cut her life short.
Eris was right there all along,
said Cloud, as recalled each memory, each one more painful than the last.
Right by our side. She was so close, we couldn't see her. What Eris did. The words she left behind. That reminds me. I was the same,
said Tifa, remembering her first meeting with Eris, during her infiltration of Don Corneo's mansion. Even though they had only just met, Eris had willingly decided to participate in Tifa's plans to find out what Don Corneo was scheming. Red 13 nodded his head, smiling softly with memories of Eris.
As was I.
He could almost feel the ancient's touch against his head, scratching behind his ears. Looking down at his tail, he remembered the way Eris would walk along behind him, her eyes lit up in fascination as she watched his tail move of its own accord.
Me too,
said Barrett. Everyone had their own memories of Eris, each one of them precious in their own way. Eris had never judged anyone based on their actions. Whether they had been terrorists, or freedom fighters, as Barrett insisted, or Shinra employees, as Kat recalled sheepishly, Eris had always been there to offer a smile. Of course, none of that had anything to do with Eris being an ancient. That was unimportant. It was just Eris being Eris. But was that always the case? Cloud thought back to the events following the destruction of the Temple of the Ancients. That strange dream he had had, when he and Eris had been standing in the middle of the sleeping forest. Had that really been a dream, or had Eris used her powers as an ancient to speak to him? Now that he thought about it more clearly, he believed it was the latter. Eris had been smiling then, too, even as she ran on through the sleeping forest to the Forgotten City. Cloud ran those last moments speaking with her in his mind.
This forest leads to the city of the ancients, and is called the Sleeping Forest. It's only a matter of time before Sephiroth uses Meteor. That's why I'm going to protect it. Only a survivor of the Cetra, like me, can do it. The secret is just up here. At least it should be. I feel it. It feels like I'm being led by something. Then, I'll be going now. I'll come back when it's all over.
She said she was the only one who could stop Sephiroth's meteor, said Cloud. Something suddenly occurred to him, and he thought about that scene again, running Eris's words over and over in his mind.
But Eris is gone,
said Tifa.
Is it impossible for us to carry on what Eris tried to accomplish?
Asked Red 13. Barrett raised one eyebrow and looked down at the hound skeptically.
We ain't no ancients, if that's what you mean,
he said.
What, did that girl go off to that place?
Asked Sid. Suddenly, Cloud snapped his fingers.
That's it.
Sid blinked.
What's it?
Cloud looked around, and his eyes lit up as a thought, for that's all it was suddenly clicked.
We don't know about it. What did Eris know?
He asked them all.
Why did she face Sephiroth without running away? I see,
said Red 13, also thinking back.
She returned there once again, correct?
Bugenhagen listened in silence as they talked. He stroked his beard. He had seen much in his long years of life and knew much about Nanaki's friends and their journey, but there was only so much his machines could tell him. It seemed that Nanaki and his companions had begun to discover the memory that they had forgotten. Perhaps returning to the scene would help them to remember it further.
The
old man said thoughtfully.
Perhaps I'll have you take me there. You're going to?
Red 13 asked, surprised.
What's so surprising about that?
Returned Bugenhagen, and his voice carried a slight, reprimanding tone.
Even I want to get out from time to time and see the outside world.
The old man then smiled and looked up at his blank dome.
I wonder what did it? I haven't felt like this in ages. It must be the planet,
said the hound, smiling back at his grandfather admiringly.
The planet is calling you.
Sid rolled his eyes and made no effort to hide the cynicism from his voice.
Yeah, hoo boy, the planet calling. Right.
Deciding that this was too philosophical for him, the pilot pushed himself away from the wall and walked out of the room, reaching for his cigarettes as he left. He had accepted much on this long journey, but the concept of a planet talking and calling out to people was just too much. Bugenhagen clasped his hands behind his back once more and looked around at those remaining in the room.
Ho ho ho,
he chuckled.
Then let's go.
One by one the others left the room, until only Cloud and Bugenhagen were left.
Oh yeah, Bugenhagen,
said Cloud, approaching the old man, who turned to face him.
I have one more thing I want to ask you.
The swordsman held out the bag he had been carrying, the one containing the huge materia.
We're carrying around huge materia. This is pretty delicate stuff and we would like to keep it in a safe place.
Bugenhagen looked at the plain, nondescript bag with interest.
Ho ho ho. Then we'll put it upstairs,
he said.
Now, shall we be on our way? I'll teach you how to work the machine. Watch carefully now. You just pull this here.
Cloud watched as Bugenhagen pulled on the lever next to the machine and then joined him on the panel. It hummed and the lights dimmed, making the room dark. Lights then came on from the dome overhead and the panel began to rise. Cloud looked up as they ascended into the observatory, where Bugenhagen watched the stars and planets, as well as the events of the world. Once they were inside the dome, Cloud opened the bag. Reaching inside, Cloud pulled out one of the 3 pieces of huge materia. He held it out in front of him. The materia floated up out of his palm and hovered in the air before him, of its own will. The materia then floated slowly across the holographic solar system, stopping beneath one of the larger planets that circled the dome. As Cloud withdrew the other 2 pieces, Bugenhagen examined them with interest.
Ho ho ho. Is this what you call huge materia?
He watched as the other 2 pieces copied the first and floated across the dome, stopping beneath the large planet. The old man stroked his beard.
This is really rare materia, indeed. Materia this rare is certain to have a special consciousness enclosed in it.
Putting the bag down on the panel, Cloud approached one of the floating pieces. He had not been able to properly examine them before, not with everything that had gone on. Now that he had chance, he looked at it closely. The huge materia's rugged surface glittered as the light of the holographic sun passed over it. As Cloud leaned over, the materia began to glow a gentle green. It had gentle warmth that passed over his face like a warm breath.
Huge materia,
the swordsman whispered softly.
It's glowing strangely.
He moved closer to it. He could feel its power lying dormant inside it, waiting to be activated.
This color. It's the same color as magic materia.
Cloud left that one and went to the next piece of huge materia. This one was a fiery red, and emitted a fierce glow as he approached. Its heat burned hotly against his face as he leaned in.
This color. It's the same color as summoned materia.
Cloud left that one and went over to the last piece of huge materia, the one they collected from the rocket. The 4th and final piece still lay at the bottom of the ocean in the sunken submarine. As Cloud stood by the 3rd piece, it started to glow. Unlike the other pieces, this one emitted a cold, icy glow. As Cloud leaned over, he could see his breath puff out in front of him, condensing on the materia's surface. Curious, Cloud touched the huge materia's crystal surface with the tip of his finger. He recoiled instantly as an icy chill spread through his hand, making it numb. Cloud rubbed his hands vigorously, trying to restore its warmth. It wasn't just the glow that was cold, the materia itself was cold as ice. It hadn't been that cold on the rocket ship. What was making it so cold? A loud roar suddenly shook the dome. Cloud and Bugenhagen looked up in alarm as it echoed around them, making the dome rattle loudly. Even the holographic stars and planets quivered.
Is that Bahamut?
Cloud asked. A second roar sounded, deeper than the first. It joined with the first roar, until both were roaring in unison. A flash of light caught his eye. Cloud looked down at his gauntlet. The 2 pieces of summoned materia Bahamut and Neo Bahamut were both pulsing with light. A third roar sounded in reply to the 2 dragons' calls. The 2 summoned materias glowed fiercely and rattled in their holdings. There was another flash of light, and Cloud looked up at the huge materia in front of him. The huge materia glowed brightly, the light pulsing in waves across its surface. The unknown roar sounded once again, making the dome rattle right down to its bolts. The light intensified, and something dropped from the huge materia and rolled by Cloud's feet. The two summoned materia in Cloud's gauntlet stopped shaking, and the light gradually faded. Cloud lowered his arms and looked at the huge materia. The materia was no longer glowing, and returned to its dormant, coldly glowing state. Cloud turned his attention to the item by his feet. It was a ball of summon materia. It was a slightly deeper shade of red than ordinary summon materia, but it was summon materia all the same. Cloud bent down and picked it up, holding it up to his eye so he could see inside. There was the shadow of a six-winged dragon there, roaring silently. Cloud looked at the huge materia in wonder. Was this the kind of power the huge materia was capable of bestowing?
Ho ho ho!
Bugenhagen's chuckle came so suddenly that Cloud nearly dropped the new materia. He looked up at the old man.
Good.
The old man said with a grin.
Now let's leave. Do you remember how to use the machine below?
Cloud nodded.
If you ever want to see the materia, come here anytime.
Standing outside the operations room on board the Highwind, Bugenhagen took a long, deep breath and sighed in satisfaction.
Smells like machinery,
he said with another sigh. He looked back at Cloud, who stood behind him.
I love this smell. Of course, I also love the smell of nature, too.
The old man floated forward, his head turning this way and that, taking in the sights of the airship's interior. He nodded to himself, noting what a wonderful piece of machinery it was. The old man then turned and looked up at a door at the top of the steps.
Is the deck up there?
He asked. Cloud nodded. The old man grinned.
Then I'll be on the deck, just passing the time. I can feel the workings of the planet in the smell of the wind. I also feel the greatness of man's wisdom and knowledge in the smell of machinery.
The old man smiled wistfully.
Well, bye for now.
Cloud couldn't help but smile as the old man floated up the steps and disappeared on deck. Bugenhagen certainly did seem quite excited about this trip. He guessed the old man didn't get out of Cosmo Canyon that often anymore. Holograms were nice, but they did not match the real thing. Cloud decided to let the old man enjoy his moments of freedom and went up to the bridge in search of Tifa. She had been unusually quiet since leaving Cosmo Canyon, and had gone straight up on deck without saying a word to anyone. Knowing that this was not like her, he wanted to speak to her, to find out what was troubling her. He found Tifa in her usual spot on the bridge. The fighter stood gazing quietly out of the window, watching the ground rush by beneath them as the airship sped over Cosmo Canyon and headed northwest towards the Corel Plains. She still looked troubled, her brow creased in thought. Cloud came to stand beside her. She glanced at him briefly, before returning her attention back to the rushing ground. Together they watched as the rocky cliffs gave way to the grassy fields of the Corel Plains. Up ahead they could see the desert that surrounded the gold saucer. The airship would cross the desert and head out into the ocean, heading for the Forgotten City. As the airship began to make its way across the vast desert, Tifa sighed heavily.
I wonder what Eris felt when she was on that altar,
she said quietly. Cloud leaned one arm against the window and watched the desert sand roll by. He remembered Eris kneeling on the altar in the depths of the Forgotten City, her hands folded and eyes closed in prayer. In his mind's eye she opened her eyes and looked at him, that soft smile touching her lips. And then a dark wing descended. The swordsman shook the image from his mind.
I'm sure she wanted to give her life for the planet,
he answered finally. Tifa bit her lip and looked down at the floor.
Really? I wonder,
she said. She shook her head, her hair tumbling over her shoulders.
I don't think that's it at all. I think she didn't think she would die at all, but that she planned on coming back all along.
The fighter looked up again, looking past the desert and towards the horizon.
She always used to talk about next time. She talked about the future more than any of us. Although she never talked about it to us, she must be had a rough life. I think Eris looked forward to tomorrow and the future more than anyone.
The fighter sighed again.
She must be had many dreams.
Before Cloud could reply, something hit the airship. Or rather, they hit something. Some unseen force blocked their way across the desert, and they had driven right into it without knowing. The airship was hurled sideways, throwing Cloud and Tifa and all those on board off their feet and skidding across the floor. The airship began to descend swiftly, heading towards the ground. Sid was the first to his feet. He rushed to take the wheel, which was spinning wildly out of control without the pilot there to control it. He grabbed the wheel and held it firmly. It strained against him, but Sid held it firm and refused to let go. Gritting his teeth, he began to pull the wheel back to the left, trying to steady the ship. The engines heaved loudly, but steadily the airship began to regain its balance. It also stopped falling thankfully and returned to its level flight. Red 13 climbed to his feet and shook his head. He looked around, and his eyes widened in alarm as he realized that Bugenhagen was not among them. With a cry he leapt up onto the main bridge and rushed out in search of his grandfather. Cat tried to call him back, but the hound did not listen to him. Cat hesitated, and then followed the hound out the door.
"What was that?"
Sid demanded. A loud, chilling roar echoed throughout the airship. It was so loud and so piercing that everyone had to cover their ears, lest their eardrums burst from the pitch. Cloud opened his eyes and inched forward carefully towards the window. He looked out, trying to see what was making such an awful, soul-shaking noise. Something began to rise up out of the desert sand. One look told Cloud instantly what it was, and the swordsman cursed violently. This was all they needed right now. It was Weapon. This one was red, with enormously long arms that ended in claws so huge and powerful they made the Buster's sword look like a table knife. Weapon had been hiding beneath the desert sands around the gold saucer until now. The unseen force that had almost knocked the airship out of the air had been its barrier, which they had disturbed when they ran into it. Weapon rose up and towered over the airship. It raised its two arms and screeched loudly, painfully. Once more Cloud and the others clamped their hands over their ears, trying to block out the awful sound.
"Weapon!"
Barrett spat when he could hear again.
"Aw shit!"
The ex-resistance leader struggled to his knees and crawled over to Cloud by the window.
"Yo, Cloud!"
he shouted.
"What do we do?"
Cloud glared back at him, and then looked out at Weapon. This was not an ideal place to fight. The Highwind was not a battleship, it wasn't built for this kind of battle. If they had not run into its barrier, they would not have known Weapon was lying here at all. It had not bothered the people of Gold Saucer until now, so it likely wouldn't have done anything at all. Now that they had disturbed it, however, simply flying away was no longer an option. They would have to fight it, somehow. Perhaps Bugenhagen knew of a way. Bugenhagen! Cloud cursed. The old man was up on deck. It was probable that the old man had been thrown overboard during the collision, but if not then he was a sitting duck for Weapon. Cloud pushed Barrett aside and ran for the door, ignoring Barrett's calls. Cloud leaped down the stairs and onto the central deck. He ran across the bridge and reached for his Buster sword. He hoped the old man was all right, and that he had somehow managed to stay on board the airship. If he was still on board, then there was a chance he could get him to safety, away from Weapon.
"Hey, Cloud!"
The swordsman skidded to a stop and spotted Yuffie clinging to the rail bordering the bridge. She was pale, but had managed to gather enough of herself to talk.
"What's going on?"
the young ninja demanded.
"There was this shaking, and then Red and Cat came running past, shouting something about the old guy. What's happening?" "Where did they go?"
asked Cloud. The ninja pointed to the stairs.
"Up there,"
she said. Cloud followed her finger. They had run on deck, it seemed. Perhaps the old man was all right after all.
"Come with me,"
Cloud ordered, and then hurried towards the steps. Yuffie watched him go, and pulled out her crystal cross.
"What? No please,"
she asked, hurt, and then followed Cloud up the steps onto the deck. End of chapter. Episode 27, Part 13, Chapter 25. Chapter 25. There was a strong wind blowing when Cloud and Yuffie ran onto the outer deck. Sand was being blown up from the desert below and falling like rain upon the airship, scattered by the Highwind's propellers. Yuffie was forced to shield her eyes with her armor to keep from being blinded by the flying grains. Cloud stood in front of her, blocking the sand, and scanned the deck for signs of Red 13 and Cat She. He spotted them at the other end of the deck. The two were standing close together and looking up at Weapon. Cloud strained his eyes. Just behind Cat She and his mob he caught a flash of blue and white. Then Cat shifted and Cloud got a better look past him, and he sighed with relief. The old man was there, and he was all right. Cloud tried to call out to them, but the howling wind and the deafening roar of the airship's engines drowned out his voice. Weapon looked down at the airship. The high wind was about 2/3 the size of Weapon, but when Weapon stretched up to its full height it seemed much smaller. Its tiny eyes, visible only through the red glow that radiated from within them, glanced left and right and then settled on the airship. Its gaze turned to those standing on the deck. Weapon roared and raised one of its long, clawed hands, and then brought it down upon the airship. Seeing the hand descend, Cloud darted forward. He drew his sword as he ran in front of Red 13 and Catchy and caught one of the claws with the blade of the Buster's sword. The strength of the blow was immense and almost forced Cloud onto his knees. Cloud lacked the physical strength to stop the blow entirely, but he managed to push it off course. The claw swerved out of the way of the others and hit the back end of the high wind, tilting it back. The hand then slipped off the edge and slammed into the sand below. The high wind steadied itself and began to move away from Weapon. In the cockpit Sid was frantically turning the wheel and cursing loudly, shouting at the airship and telling it to move faster and bring some distance between them and the enemy. Weapon's head moved, following the movements of the airship. It raised one large, flat foot and stepped forward. The ground trembled as the foot landed on the ground and sent clouds of sand shifting across the desert, much like a ripple in water. It took only a single step for Weapon to catch up with the airship. There it stopped, lifted its head and roared. In the lower half of its torso was large hollow containing a laser. This hollow began to glow red, and sparks of red light flickered around it. These sparks were being drawn into the hollow, and the glow became brighter. Cloud's eyes widened. It didn't take a genius to figure out what was coming next. He lowered his sword and turned to his friends.
"Get back inside,"
he ordered.
"And tell Sid to move the ship away."
Cat didn't need telling twice. He turned to Bugenhagen and began to usher the old man towards Yuffie, who was calling to them from the doorway. Cloud went with them, helping Bugenhagen along. It was just their luck that this happened when they had Red 13's grandfather on the ship with them. If it was just them, they could fight Weapon and take it out. Suddenly, Cloud stopped. He looked around. Speaking of Red 13? Where was he? The swordsman turned and looked back along the deck. Red 13 was still standing at the far end of the deck, he had not moved. The hound's head was low, and his mouth was curled back into a ferocious snarl. He did not seem to notice that Cloud and the others had gone. In truth, he did not even notice that Cloud had ran in front of them and blocked the falling claw. All of his attention was fixed on Weapon. His eye narrowed, and he growled angrily.
"Red 13!
Shouted Cloud.
"Come on! Get over here!"
The hound either did not hear him or was ignoring him. He crouched down low, his furry chest brushing the ground. He raised his head and howled loudly into the wind. The sound of his howl was carried by the wind to all parts of the airship and was heard even by those inside, sounding as eerie and ghostly as the call of the planet.
"Oh dear,"
said Catchy, jumping onto Yuffie's shoulder.
"I think seeing Ruby Weapon near his grandfather has made Red 13 go berserk."
The cat shook his head.
"I doubt he can hear anyone right now. Well, good luck."
Cloud turned sharply.
"What do you mean, good luck, hey?"
He didn't get to finish his sentence. Catchy had already jumped off the ninja's shoulder and was scurrying back inside the airship. His Mog went after him, waddling down the steps as fast as its short, fat legs could carry it. Cloud scowled and cursed under his breath. Damn them both. He turned back to the deck just as Red 13 dropped his head, snarled, and then charged forward. The hound leaped and landed on the rails, but then he jumped again and disappeared over the edge of the airship.
"Red 13!
Yuffie ran to the rails and leaned over. She caught sight of Red 13 as he dropped through the swirling sand and onto what was Weapon's kneecap. The hound landed and scrabbled wildly for a moment, and she feared he would lose his grip and fall completely. Then she saw the hound steady himself and begin to scramble his way upward. Weapon, or as Cat had called it, Ruby Weapon, likely due to the ruby-colored hue of the metallic-like plating that covered its body, lowered its two outrageously long arms and placed the claws on the sand. The high wind was climbing slowly and was in direct range of the monster's primary weapon. The air around the laser cannon in its torso began to waver hotly as the weapon prepared to fire. A shot fired and struck Ruby Weapon squarely in the middle of its metallic forehead. The monster stepped back, startled. Its laser fired and a thin beam of red light burst out, heading for the airship. Luckily, the suddenness of the attack caused Ruby Weapon to lift its upper body a fraction at the last minute, and the red beam zipped over the airship, missing it. Cloud ran to the opposite end of the deck and looked out to see where it was heading. It was heading for the gold saucer. Business was being conducted as usual in the Gold Saucer. It was the only place that had not been affected by the fear and panic that was slowly spreading through the rest of the world. To the people that went there it was a refuge, a place where they could forget about their fears and their worries, if only for a little while. Of course, it would all be different if they knew that Ruby Weapon was lurking in the desert that surrounded the theme park. Dio, manager of the Gold Saucer, was the only one who knew about Ruby Weapon's presence. He had kept that information secret, for fear it would send panic rippling through his customers. A panicked populace was difficult to maintain and would likely cause more harm than good. Besides, Ruby Weapon had made no moves to attack. So Dio kept the monster's presence a secret, but monitored it closely. He was standing in the arcade when the red beam shot past the Gold Saucer, thankfully missing the arcade. Due to the noise and the bright lights already flashing, very few actually noticed it. Those who did see the beam believed it was a part of the Gold Saucer's fireworks display, and so they cheered and clapped for more. Dio saw the beam and knew immediately what it was. He frowned, and his brow creased. Had Ruby Weapon launched an attack at last? Deciding the situation needed close observation, he slipped away from the celebrations and returned to the peace and quiet of his personal room where he could watch the events unfold. Vincent raised his gun and fired a second shot at Ruby Weapon. This time, he caught the monster in the side of its face, and Weapon's head was thrown sideways in the impact. The monster gave an angered roar, took a step back away from the airship. It raised an arm to shield its face from further shots. Seeing that the ray had missed the Gold Saucer, Cloud turned away from the rail and turned to Vincent, who was standing in the doorway.
Vincent?
The gunman stepped silently out of the doorway. His cape flew back in the wind, and Cloud saw the small shape of Cat Shi standing behind him. The cat rubbed his nose and walked towards Cloud.
Thought you might need a hand,
he said cheerfully. Vincent lowered his gun and placed more bullets into the chamber. Clicking the barrel shut, he raised the gun and aimed once more at Weapon's head. The towering monster was still shielding its face with one hand. Its eyes peered out between the claws, red and menacing, searching for the source of the attack.
This is no time for talking,
he said gruffly.
Just kill it. Are you insane?
Yuffie exclaimed. She pointed up at the towering creature.
How can we possibly defeat that? It's, like, bigger than this rust bucket.
The high wind gave a deep groan and tilted back a little. It began to climb faster. Sid was pushing the engines hard to get them out of reach of Ruby Weapon's ray. Of course, it made little difference how far away they were. Weapon could catch up to them in a matter of steps. Cloud looked up at the creature that the planet had created to be its ultimate defense. Ruby Weapon's whole body was covered in a thick hide that gleamed like metal. It was immensely huge and strong. His shoulder still hurt from blocking that earlier blow. Did they have a chance? Was it worth the risk? The answer was obvious even as he thought the question.
We have no other choice,
he said. Ignoring Yuffie's horrified look, he continued,
the weapons are built to protect the planet from any threat that may cause it harm. We're human. It won't distinguish us from anyone else. If we don't kill it here, it might go after the people in the Gold Saucer next.
The swordsman looked at Vincent. The gunman nodded. He had thought the same. Cloud turned his attention back to Weapon, his gaze traveling downwards.
Besides, the swordsman added dryly, I don't think Red 13 is going to come along willingly.
Yuffie followed Cloud and Vincent's gazes to Ruby Weapon. Red 13 was still there, scrambling across the creature's giant legs, attacking wildly and without control. The ninja sighed heavily. She reached behind her and unhooked her shuriken.
Well, fine, she said, if you want to get yourselves killed, I'll just have to protect you.
That was just like her. It was also interesting to note that now she had something important to do, her motion sickness had disappeared. The three fighters walked out to the center of the deck. Cat Shi watched them go. He scratched his furry chin thoughtfully and then shook his head. This was one fight the cat would prefer to miss. Cloud, Vincent, and Yuffie could handle this. Probably. So Cat shouted good luck to his friends and then disappeared back inside the airship, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. Realizing that the attacks had stopped, Ruby Weapon lowered its arm. It took a half step backward and then raised its other arm. It spread its claws wide, and then the creature thrust out its arm at alarming speed and grabbed the airship in mid-flight. The high wind gave a violent shudder and lurched to the side as it was caught in Weapon's grasp. Ruby Weapon stretched its arm out, holding the airship at arm's length. The claws closed around the hull, narrowly missing the bridge where Sid and the rest of his friends still stood. The sudden lurch had knocked everybody else off their feet, but Sid remained standing, fighting to regain control of his airship. The former Shinra pilot turned the wheel as far as it would go, until it locked in place. His crew crawled and scrambled back to their posts and worked frantically, while the crew in the engine room tried to draw whatever power they could get from the engines. They had to break free of this grip. The engines groaned and heaved, straining against the claws that were holding them in place. After a few moments of straining, a painful scraping and screeching sound could be heard. Hurriedly Sid unlocked the steering wheel and ordered his crew to stop. It was no use. They would damage their engines if they tried to break free. The sudden tilt of the airship had also thrown those on the outer deck off their feet. Cloud, Vincent, and Yuffie clung to the railings as the deck heaved. With the airship caught in one hand, Weapon stretched out its other hand and closed its claws around the rear of the airship. The rails of the outer deck bent against the strain but held firm, refusing to snap. The claws held the airship firmly, keeping it from moving. When the airship finally stopped shuddering, Cloud let go of the rails and rose to his feet. He looked down the deck. One of the monstrous claws was nearby. In fact, it would have impaled Vincent, if the gunman had not seen it coming and moved hurriedly out of the way. The other two were wrapped around the rear of the airship. The claw on deck was the only thing holding the other two in place. If that claw was cut, the other claws would slip away and Weapon would lose its grip. The swordsman leaned over the side of the airship and looked down at the hull. The hull was in a similar position, with two claws gripping the upper half while the third was pressed underneath. He turned his attention back to Ruby Weapon. The creature's pointed jaw hung open, and there was a low growl from deep within its throat. It was making no other moves to attack. Cloud guessed it was waiting for its ray to recharge so it could eliminate them in a single shot, unable to escape. He could not see Red 13.
Vincent? Yuffie?
The two stood up and turned to him. Cloud held out his sword and pointed down the length of Weapon's arm.
Think you can run across that?
Vincent also looked. The creature's arm was held out straight, and was wide enough at the wrists to act as a suitable path. The arm became smaller the closer to the shoulders it got, but it was probably still wide enough to walk on. The gunman looked back at Cloud, guessing what he was planning.
Think you can cut through these things?
He asked in turn, gesturing to the thick claws that gleamed like platinum. Cloud nodded his head.
Yeah.
He pointed to a spot on the underside of the claw that rested on the deck. There was a deep graze about a quarter of the way through the claw, made when Cloud had blocked it and pushed it aside. It was superficial damage, nothing more, but it was damage nonetheless.
Vincent, Yuffie,
said Cloud again.
I want you two to go over there and distract it. Keep its attention focused on you. I don't want it to pay attention to anything I'm doing. Once the airship is free, get out of the area, and I'll finish it with Bahamut. You really think Bahamut can beat that thing all by itself?
Yuffie asked skeptically, still leaning over the rails.
And what about Red? He's still down there, being nuts. Get him out of the way any way that you can.
Cloud hefted his sword onto his shoulder.
Now, go. We have to hurry.
Vincent did not waste time with a reply. He jumped up onto the rails and then onto Weapon's hand. Yuffie gave Cloud a mischievous grin and a mock salute before she jumped up after him. Together they began the long charge down the creature's arm. Once the two were out of the way, Cloud approached the metallic claw. The claw pressed down heavily on the railing, which bent a little further. Cloud grasped the hilt with both hands. Once he had a firm, steady grip, he raised the sword over his head, and then brought the blade down as hard as he could. Vincent ran quickly down Ruby Weapon's arm, his cape fluttering wildly behind him. Yuffie was running close behind him. He could hear her panting, her boots clicking against the arm. Ruby Weapon did not seem to notice them running along its arm. To Weapon, they were nothing more than insects scrabbling along, and as such not worth noticing. Vincent looked down towards the hole in its torso that contained its deadly laser. The hole was beginning to glow again as the monster began to recharge it. Once charged, Ruby Weapon would fire its laser, and this time it would not miss its target. The gunman raised his gun and fired 3 rounds towards the laser. The shots hit their mark and exploded just inside the cavity's rim. A ball of flame burst out and enveloped the laser. These flames were then drawn towards Weapon, being sucked into the barrel of the ray. Vincent watched as the light of the flames flickered inside the cavity and then disappeared, extinguished. Vincent raised an eyebrow.
Don't get too close to that ray, he called over his shoulder. You'll get sucked in. I don't plan on getting that close,
responded Yuffie. The ninja quickened her pace and artfully zipped past Vincent. She was much more agile than Vincent, and pulled away from him quickly. They were close to Ruby Weapon's right shoulder. The monster shifted slightly, but the two maintained their balance and kept on running. Below them, Red 13 lost his footing and slid down the plating that covered the monster's thigh. The hound scrabbled frantically, then dug in his claws and held on tight. His claws scraped across the plate before finally finding a hold, and the hound stopped just a few feet from the edge of the monster's knee. He hung there, his tail lashing wildly. Yuffie was the first to reach the shoulder. She did not stop but turned sharply to the right, her boots skidding across the armor that covered Weapon's shoulder. She ran along the back of the monster's neck, heading for the other side. Vincent stopped at the shoulder and raised his gun. He fired a series of rounds at Weapon's face, trying to draw its attention. Most of the bullets bounced off the hard plating surrounding its face, but one hit Weapon in its right eye. The eye burst on impact, and Weapon roared in anger and pain. Glowing green liquid leaked from the wound and poured down its face and neck. Lowering his gun for a moment, Vincent looked at the liquid spilling out from the wound. His red eyes narrowed. Was that Mako? Of course, the gunman realized. The weapons were made from the life stream, given life by the planet. The planet had used its own life stream to make these powerful weapons, to use when it was in peril. It made sense that the creature's lifeblood was the very energy of the planet. Weapon's head twisted painfully, and it roared in rage as more Mako streamed out of its wounded eye. Yet, despite its pain, it did not loosen its hold on the high wind. Its claws remained firmly around the airship's body, its arms refusing to budge. Yuffie reached Weapon's left shoulder. Here she stopped and turned again, facing the left side of Weapon's face. The ninja ran forward and leaped up the plates of the creature's neck and face, making her way up to the top of its head. When she reached the top, she stopped and looked down at her foe.
Let's see you handle this,
shouted the ninja, raising her armored arm. An orb of green materia in her armor glowed brightly. The ninja clenched her fist and brought it down hard to deliver a powerful punch to the central point of Ruby Weapon's head. The materia in her arm activated on contact, throbbing with inner light. The materia's power sent strong shockwaves pulsing downward throughout Weapon, beginning at its head and moving all the way down to its feet. The shockwave did not stop with Weapon. Once they reached Weapon's feet, they then moved into the ground, creating an intense, focused earthquake. The ground trembled violently, and clouds of sand rose up and swirled around the great creature. Weapon itself was struggling to maintain its balance as the ground shook and trembled around it. The creature was so tall that its large, flat feet did little to help it balance itself. It took a slight step backwards, shifting its great bulk, in an effort to keep from falling over. Even with this great attempt to distract it from the airship, it still did not relinquish its hold, nor did it take its eyes off the airship. On its head, Yuffie wobbled and tottered as the tremors continued. Finally losing her balance, she fell back. The tremors continued for a few seconds more, until they finally came to a stop. Cautiously, the ninja opened her eyes. She looked down at the spot where she had unleashed the powerful earth magic. There was a crack in the thick metal plating that covered Ruby Weapon's head, but that was the extent of the damage. The ninja sat back and sighed in exasperation. Ruby Weapon was tougher than she expected. More gunshots were fired, and Yuffie quickly ducked down and shuffled back along Weapon's head. An icy breeze blew, and Yuffie turned to see an icy formation suddenly rise up on the other side. The ice stretched up and encased half of Ruby Weapon's face, covering its gaping mouth and its wounded eye. It stayed there for a few breath-stopping moments before it cracked and shattered, breaking away. The ice did even less damage than the earth magic. All it left was a few tiny cracks in the side of its face, superficial damage, nothing more. And still it did nothing to distract Weapon's attention from the airship, or from preparing its primary weapon. The glow in Ruby Weapon's chest was steadily growing in intensity. It would not be long before the ray was ready to fire. It didn't seem like anything could distract Weapon from its task, or make it relinquish its hold. Vincent turned and looked over at the airship, still stuck in Ruby Weapon's hands. He hoped Cloud could free the airship before it fired. Cloud, meanwhile, was still on the outer deck trying to free the airship from Weapon's grasp. The claws were much harder to cut through than he had first expected. He had landed several blows now, some of them landing directly in the graze he had made earlier when Weapon attacked. Yet he had made little progress in cutting through, and in many instances the blade simply bounced off. The sword had just about managed to make it halfway through the claw. Whatever substance these claws were made of, they were a match even for the Buster's sword. Cloud raised his sword and brought it down upon the claw. The blade slid into the graze and cut another 2 inches into the claw, the best damage he had made so far. His arms were beginning to burn from the effort. Through the corner of his eye, Cloud could see Weapon's ray cannon begin to glow again. Realizing he had little time, Cloud fought against the burning pain in his arms and lifted his sword high. He brought it down with as much strength as he could muster, and struck the claw. His effort was finally rewarded. A crack appeared in the claw and spread down the rest of the claw's width. There was a moment's pause, and then the front end of the claw snapped off. The airship gave a shudder and Weapon's hand slid loose. The 2 remaining claws around the side of the airship lost their grip and fell away, releasing the back end of the airship. Ruby Weapon roared in rage as its arm dropped back to its side. It was impossible to tell if it felt the pain of losing one of its fingers. The only expression its fierce face seemed capable of expressing was anger. The monster raised its hand and looked down at the shortened stub where its finger had once been. It roared again. Without pausing, Cloud turned and ran back along the deck. In a single bound, he leaped onto the roof of the compound. He ran along the hull, heading for the hand that was gripping the other half of the high wind. As Cloud ran, he looked out across the desert towards Weapon. Now that its arm was free, Ruby Weapon was turning his attention to the 3 attackers that were moving across its body. He watched as Vincent jumped off the monster's shoulder and grabbed hold of its hand as it tried to sweep him off. The gunman clung to the claws, pulled himself up, and then fired 4 icy bullets at the monster's face. Like before, the ice exploded on impact and spread out across Weapon's face, sealing it in a layer of chilling crystal. Weapon roared. The vibrations of its voice caused the ice to break apart. The ice fell away, melting into water as it fell towards the sand. Weapon's hand drew near to its left shoulder, and as Vincent jumped off to return to the safety of the unmoving plates, Yuffie took her turn and leaped onto the hand. The ninja released her crystal cross, and the shuriken zipped quickly through the air. Riding the air currents, it zipped past Weapon's wounded eye. The crystal spikes cut into its face, making small but definite grazes in its plating. It followed the swirling currents and came to the other side of Weapon's face, this time grazing its cheek and jawline, before finally returning to the ninja's hand as she leaped off the arm and onto Weapon's right shoulder. Cloud turned his attention away from the battle and back to the task ahead. He did not need to worry, Vincent and Yuffie could handle themselves fine. Weapon's other hand was just ahead. 2 of the claws had closed themselves around the hull just behind the bridge. Luckily, the claws had missed the airship's propellers when they latched on. Unfortunately, this made the wind around the hull stronger, and more than once Cloud came close to losing his footing. Like the outer deck, the claws had made a dent in the airship's hull, but it was holding out rather well. Cloud grasped the hilt of his Buster sword, and as he neared the first of the 2 claws he twisted his body and spun, swinging his sword. The blade struck the edge of the claw. The added momentum caused by the spin was enough for the blade to cut straight through. It sliced through at an angle and a large sliver of the claw slipped across the hull. It struck the remaining claw, making it lose its grip on the hull. Both claws slid and scraped across the hull, leaving ugly scrape marks in its otherwise undamaged surface. The claws dropped off the edge and released the airship. With its impediment gone, the high wind jerked backwards. It moved so suddenly that Cloud lost his balance and was forced to cling to the roof to keep from sliding off along with the claws. The high wind rolled slightly before steadying itself and beginning to pull away from Weapon at an upward angle. Seeing the airship pulling away, Ruby Weapon unleashed its primary weapon. There was a brief pause before the ray opened fire, sending a second thin beam of red light streaming after the airship. This beam was much thinner than the first one, for the weapon was not fully charged and as such did not carry the same strength. It carried the same heat, though, and Cloud was forced to shield his eyes as it zipped by. The beam continued on. It would miss the gold saucer, as well. Ruby Weapon was so outraged that it had missed its target a second time that it lifted its head and roared in rage. The sound was so piercing that Vincent and Yuffie, in close proximity to its head, were forced to cover their ears. The monster raised its giant arms above its head. The sudden movement caused Yuffie to slip and topple forward. She slid down the front of Weapon's shoulder plate, scrabbling for a handhold. Thinking quickly, she thrust out her crystal cross. The crystal spikes scraped along the metal before finally digging in enough to gain a hold, and she slowed to a stop about a meter away from the edge of the plate. She hung there, clinging to the crystal spikes. Red 13 was halfway up Ruby Weapon's torso when the monster lifted its arms. As it stretched up, the hound lost his own footing and fell back. He dropped quickly and landed heavily on Weapon's knee where he had started. He did not stop there but rolled rapidly down the metal plating, until, finally, he rolled over the edge and fell down to the sand below. He fell into a dune and disappeared beneath the sand. Weapon closed its claws and then thrust its arms downwards. Its fists plunged deep into the sand. The ground gave a low rumble and the sand shifted, as though something was stirring beneath it. The airship, now safely out of reach above Weapon, turned to watch. The sand quivered and then suddenly spurted upwards in two large columns. From them emerged two equally large tendrils, silver in color, more than 2 meters wide and 15 meters long. The tendrils gave a sharp flick, and the rest of the sand fell back to the ground. One tendril flicked back and hit the ground, making it tremble. Inside the high wind, Sid, Tifa, Barrett, and Katshi watched as the tendrils stretched up to their full height, their tips waving wildly outside the glass.
"That,"
said Sid,
"is not good."
End of chapter. Episode 28, Part 13, Chapter 26. Chapter 26. When Red 13 opened his eyes, he found that, somehow, the scenery had changed. He was surrounded by sand on all sides. It was in his fur, his eyes, and when he opened his mouth to call out to his friends it fell into his mouth. The hound coughed and gasped for breath. Where was he? The last thing he remembered was running out onto the deck of the Highwind and seeing his grandfather gazing up at the sky. He remembered running towards Bugenhagen, and then following his gaze. Twisting his body into a direction he believed to be upwards, he began to scrabble furiously. Finally, his head broke through the surface of the sand pile. As air rushed across his nose, he inhaled deeply. Once his lungs were full, he began to scrabble again, wriggling and writhing until his body follows his head out of the pile. Red 13 shook himself down, shaking off the sand that covered his fur. A shadow fell over him. The hound looked up and gasped. In the air above him, descending rapidly, was a large metal foot. Without hesitating to think, Red 13 leaped out of the way. The foot slammed into the ground a moment later, flattening the sand pile and sending a cloud of sand swirling into the air. The impact of the foot's landing caused the ground to quake, and Red 13 lost his footing and slid down another, smaller sand pile. When he finally regained his balance, the hound stood and looked upward. The sight he saw made him want to bury himself back in the sand. The monstrous foot that almost squashed him like a pancake belonged to Ruby Weapon, the most monstrous creature Red 13 had ever seen. Flashes of light gunshots probably appeared at regular intervals around the monster's face. He saw the airship, too, hovering some distance away. As he watched, the monster opened its jaws wide. The inside of its mouth glowed, and then a powerful jet of flames suddenly burst out into the air. The flames swept across the sky and headed for the Highwind. Unable to rise or descend in time, Sid locked the forward engines and then turned the airship sharply to the left. In response, the Highwind's back end swerved to the right. The stream of flames fired past, so close that the flames almost scorched the rear propellers. The flames stopped coming, and Ruby Weapon closed its jaws. Through its one remaining eye it saw that it had missed for a third time and roared in rage. The two tall spires sticking out of the sand began to thrash and whip about in all directions. They slammed into the ground, destroying dunes and covering the ground in a thick cloud of sand. Through the smothering haze, Red 13 caught a glimpse of something large and silver-white heading his way, and once more he rolled out of the way before he was crushed beneath the thrashing spire. Ruby Weapon was so outraged by its third failure to destroy the airship that it no longer had any control over the two spires, even though they were a part of its body. The spires moved of their own accord, striking anything that came within reach. They did not seem to make a distinction between the ground or its own body, for the spires even whipped back and struck Ruby Weapon's torso with powerful blows. Fed up of standing around doing nothing, Red 13 dropped to a crouch and darted across the sand. He leaped as high as he could and landed on the nearest of the two spires. He tried to dig in his claws, but the spire was so smooth that they slid right off. Red 13 dropped back to the sand. He leaped again and this time tried to close his jaws around it, but his teeth too slid straight off. With a growl, the hound leapt out of the way again. It was impossible, he could not get a grip on them. The two spires continued to thrash and flail wildly, still out of control. The Highwind was just out of their reach, but those still on Ruby Weapon were not as fortunate. Vincent hurriedly ducked behind the back of Weapon's neck as the tip of one spire came perilously close to its shoulder. It missed, but just barely. Yuffie was still dangling from Weapon's shoulder, clinging to her shuriken. The other spire then whipped up and struck Ruby Weapon in the side of its arm. The impact shook the shuriken loose, and Yuffie dropped fast towards the sand below. The spire, still moving, gave another sharp crack and struck her as she dropped. The ninja was whipped to the side, heading towards the sand at high speed. The ninja hit the ground hard. She lost hold of her shuriken as she landed, and the weapon rolled across the sand until it stopped, half buried. Yuffie, too, rolled across the ground, with a cloud of sand rising around her. She rolled at least 15 meters before finally coming to a stop not far from where her shuriken lay. Seeing the young ninjas fall, Red 13 hurried over to her.
"Are you all right?"
he asked, his eyes worried. For a moment the ninja did not move, and Red 13 started to fear the worst. Then the ninja twitched, coughed, and shakily climbed to her knees. She coughed again, bringing up the sand that she had swallowed. The hound put a paw on her back and patted her gently. He heard her say something, and he leaned in close to hear.
"Damn it,"
she muttered under her breath between coughs.
"Try that on me, will you? Just try it again, I promise you'll regret it."
Red 13 sat back on his haunches and sighed heavily. She was all right, it seemed. The sound of gunshots came from above, and Red 13 raised his head. He could not see Vincent from where they were, but he guessed that the gunman was trying to draw the monster's attention. His thoughts were confirmed when Ruby Weapon turned its head away from the airship and sent another blast of flame over his shoulder. The hound drew a breath, he hoped Vincent was all right. Yuffie heard the shots too and looked up dazedly. When she saw the flames her mind cleared in a flash. Crying out, she grabbed hold of Red 13 and pulled him to her.
"Red 13. We need to get out of here now,"
she said.
"Cloud told us to distract Weapon long enough so that he could free the airship, and then he was going to pummel it with summons. So come on, let's move it already, before we get pummeled, too."
A shadow fell over them both. Quickly the two pushed away from each other, just as the tip of one of the spires slammed into the sand between them. Yuffie rolled and snatched her shuriken up out of the sand, and then began to run as fast as she could away from the spires. Red 13 ran close behind her, though he still had no idea what was going on. Vincent meanwhile, was still on Weapon's upper body. He had managed to draw the monster's attention onto him for now, and had even managed to damage the plating of its face after a few well-aimed shots. Weapon lifted its large shoulders and forward. The sudden movement caught Vincent off guard and caused him to lose his balance. He tried to grab hold of the ridges of the monster's neck, but they were just out of his reach. With nothing else to hold onto, he fell off Weapon's shoulder and began hurtling towards the ground at speed. A dark, purplish light swept over him as he fell. The dark light moved up and over his body, growing until it covered him entirely. Inside that light, his body began to grow and twist, forming into the shape of a new creature the others had not seen before. It was a haunting creature. The aura it gave off was chilling, almost as cold and terrifying as the aura given off by the weapons. In time, Cloud and the others would learn that there was a horrifying link between this creature and the weapons, but for now all that was known about it was the creature's name, Chaos. The creature was still Vincent, and yet it was not Vincent. It had Vincent's face, but the face was pale, almost deathly, and carried a deep malice. Vincent's calm red eyes had been replaced by eyes that were bright yellow and that glowed with an unearthly aura. The gunman's cloak and clothing had gone, replaced by a skin-tight leather outfit that had various pieces of armor attached to it. Two large, leathery wings, frayed at the edges, protruded from Chaos's back. Finally, in Chaos's hand, there was a large, three-barreled shotgun. Chaos stretched out his wings. They caught the wind and slowed his descent long before he reached the ground. Using the air current, Chaos swerved away from the ground and darted across the sand away from Weapon. He turned again in mid-flight, heading back to the sky. Seeing him flying away, Weapon opened its mouth and unleashed another powerful stream of flames. Chaos turned sharply, moving easily out of the flames' path. The stream continued on past Chaos and would have hit the airship if Sid had not seen them coming and quickly moved the high wind out of the way. Cloud shielded his face with his arm as the heat of the flames blew over the airship. The flames made the air hot and made his throat burn. The heat passed, and he caught a glimpse of Chaos as he lowered his arm. Chaos was diving towards Weapon at speed, his gun held out in front of him. The winged beast fired a shot at Weapon. The bullet struck Weapon in the shoulder and tore right through its armor. A large, gaping hole was left in the armor where the bullet struck, oozing more greenish liquid. Weapon craned its head forward and tried to snap at Chaos as he flew by. Chaos, too quick for it, flew swiftly out of the way. Movement caught his eye, and Cloud glanced over his shoulder. He relaxed when he saw that it was Tifa, coming out to check on him.
"How's it going?"
she asked, standing beside him. Cloud didn't answer her. He turned his eyes back to the battlefield. Chaos was diving again, this time at Weapon's rear. He fired a second shot and hit Weapon's left arm. The plates covering its arm were blasted away by the shot and fell towards the sand. Whatever those bullets were made of, Weapon's armor could not defend against them. Cloud sheathed his sword. It was time to end it. He looked down at his gauntlet. The Bahamut materia was glowing slightly, radiating a deep red light. Cloud could feel Bahamut's rage, its eagerness, its desire to fight. It could sense a powerful, worthy foe nearby. The dragon longed to break free of its realm and fight this worthy foe. Tifa followed his gaze. She placed her fingertips lightly over the materia's smooth surface. It glimmered at her touch. The Neo-Bahamut materia, lying next to it, also began to glow. It shuddered slightly in its slot, as though trying to call itself out.
I'm sure they can handle it,
she said, answering Cloud's unspoken thoughts. Cloud clenched his fist. Tifa was right. Bahamut, Neo-Bahamut, and the rest of the summons they had gathered on their journey, were also born from the planet just like the weapons. With the summons at their side, they had the chance to defeat Weapon. Cloud lowered his hand and stepped forward to the edge of the deck.
Tifa, he began, tell Sid to move the airship away. I don't want the high wind to get caught up in this.
Sure. Tifa ran back across the deck. She stopped by the door and looked back at him. She opened her mouth, but then closed it again. This was hardly the time, and she couldn't find the words right then. She would have to wait for another time. Instead she smiled, and then ran back inside the airship. When she was gone, Cloud turned all his attention back to the battle at hand. During his conversation with Tifa, Chaos had managed to land more hits into Ruby Weapon's armor. Its torso was dotted with holes. One of the enormous plates that protected its shoulders had been shot clean off that now lay broken on the sand below. Ruby Weapon fired yet another blast of fire as Chaos drew near. Chaos swerved easily out of the way and headed upward. He flew close to the airship. His head turned upward and he saw Cloud standing on the deck, looking down at him. The swordsman caught his yellow-eyed gaze and nodded. Chaos understood Cloud's silent message and sheathed his gun. He turned away from Weapon and dived down toward the sand, searching for Yuffie and Red 13. With Chaos out of range, Weapon raised its head. Its one good eye fell on the airship, and directly met Cloud's gaze. A deep, cold shiver ran down Cloud's spine. The fear generated by these weapons was unreal, almost paralyzing. Cloud had heard Sid and the others tell of their encounter with the draconic weapon back in Mideel, but he had not believed the fear could be so intense. Cloud scowled and shook his head vigorously to shake away the fear. Weapon was indeed monstrous and powerful, but it was not entirely invulnerable. The holes in its armor were proof enough of that. And he would drive that point home by using the planet's own power to destroy it, the power of the summons. Cloud inhaled deeply, and released it in a slow, calming breath. He raised his fist, clenched it tight. The Bahamut materia began to glow as Cloud called upon its power. Pulsing red-white light began to form around his gauntlet and fall in waves down his arm. The materia began to shudder within its slot, as though the materia itself was straining to be released. The droplets of light slowed until finally they ceased to fall. The light's course then reversed, being drawn upwards around his fist. Cloud waited until all the light had gathered before he thrust out his hand and unleashed all of the pent-up energy. The light fired like a bullet and whooshed through the air. It moved at immense speed and headed towards Weapon's face. Ruby Weapon sat it coming and moved its head to the side, allowing the light to zip past. The light continued onward, flying through the air. It grew in size, twisting and taking shape. The light flashed brightly and then vanished in an instant, leaving in its wake a monstrous black dragon. Bahamut, the legendary dragon. People told tales of this great and powerful dragon, said to be the most powerful of the summons created by the planet. Scientists conducting research into the summon materias theorized that there were many different variations of Bahamut. In truth, there were many great and powerful dragons that fell into the Bahamut class. The one that Cloud had summoned was thought to be the original version of Bahamut, the two-winged black dragon. Cloud had in his possession two other types of Bahamut materia. He had Neo-Bahamut, the four-winged dragon, positioned ready next to its partner. The newest addition, provided by the huge materia, was currently locked up in the supply case they had brought with them onto the airship. This dragon, Bugenhagen said, was known as Bahamut Zero. Bahamut Zero was a dragon with 6 wings, and was the most powerful of the dragon summons, at least, of those that had been revealed. Bugenhagen had said that he believed there to be other dragon summons that were stronger than Bahamut Zero, but that their existence had been kept secret for the public's safety. If that were the case, it did not take a genius to figure out who had covered up the existence of these more powerful dragons. Bahamut spread his large wings. They gave a loud snap as they opened and caught the air. The dragon drew his arms and legs close to his chest and tilted his wings, turning sharply in mid-flight and speeding back towards Weapon. Ruby Weapon tried to turn its head, but since its arms were buried in the sand, it was not able to turn fully. It caught only a glimpse of the black dragon as he swooped in and slammed its body hard into its back. The impact caused Weapon to pitch forward, placing all its weight on its arms. Those same arms acted as a counterbalance, taking the full force of the blow and preventing Weapon from being bowled over. That fact seemed to frustrate Bahamut, and so the dragon flapped his wings and pulled back from Weapon. After flying back about 15 meters, the dragon landed on the sand and charged forward. He roared piercingly before clamping his jaws around Weapon's arm and refusing to let go. Ruby Weapon turned his head and unleashed a thin stream of flames at Bahamut. The flames swept over the dragon's head. Bahamut roared in pain and released his grip, stepping back away from the flames. He shook his head back and forth, trying to shake off the flames. Once he had finished shaking off the flames, Bahamut dropped his upper body close to the ground and lifted his tail high. Bahamut then swung his body around and slammed his tail into Weapon's side. The armor covering Weapon's back cracked and splintered and small chunks of metal went falling down to the ground below. Despite that, Weapon only seemed more irritated than in pain, and it opened its mouth to shoot another blast of fire. There was a second bright flash of light, and something large and heavy slammed into Weapon's chest before it could fire. It was Neo Bahamut, summoned by Cloud to aid his comrade in bringing the monstrous weapon down. This dragon was much larger and more heavily built than Bahamut, with much of his strength lying in his huge, muscular torso and powerful hind legs. Bahamut relied on his speed and agility to surprise and gain advantage over his prey, but Neo Bahamut preferred to rely on sheer brute force. Aside from his heavier bulk, he was further identified by his thick, mud-red scales and his 4 large wings that beat in almost perfect unison as the dragon pushed his head and shoulders into Weapon's chest, trying to force it back. Not even Ruby Weapon could properly brace itself against the blow. Neo Bahamut had slammed into it with all the force that he could muster. As with Bahamut, it was only because Weapon's arms were buried so deep into the sand that the creature wasn't thrown onto its back. Seeing that he was getting nowhere, Neo Bahamut drew back away from Weapon. His wings with a wingspan of more than 10 meters from wingtip to wingtip spread wide. Beating his wings, the dragon rose into the air. He soared up to the sky, flying past the high wind, before he turned and fell into a steep dive at Weapon. The dragon lifted his body at the last moment, pulling his body back into level flight just over Weapon's head. The dragon kept on moving and flew over the top of Weapon. Reaching out with his feet, the dragon grabbed hold of Weapon's shoulders and held on tight as he flew onward, preparing to rise back into the sky. Weapon gave a roar and lurched backward, yanked roughly back by Neo Bahamut as he tried to drag the creature off its feet. The dragon's strength was immense, and even though Weapon's arms were still in the sand, it was steadily being lifted up off the ground. Bahamut tried to help his draconic comrade by slamming his tail repeatedly against Weapon's arms. The continuous beating gradually began to weaken Ruby Weapon's hold on the ground. The 2 spires quit flailing mindlessly and locked into place, pointing straight up into the sky. Suddenly, the monster's arms shuddered and then shot swiftly upwards. In turn, the spires sank rapidly into the sand and re-emerged as Weapon's arms came out of the sand. Neo Bahamut roared in triumph and beat his wings harder, ripping Weapon out of the ground and carrying him up into the sky. It was truly a remarkable sight, as the great dragon dragged Ruby Weapon off the ground and carried it into the sky. Trapped in the dragon's vice-like grip, there was little Ruby Weapon could do to stop the dragon besides dangle. Only once did Weapon try to break free, striking out at Neo Bahamut with its long, flailing arms. The first slender spire struck the dragon in the thigh and bounced off his thick scales, leaving nothing more than a nick in his hide. As Weapon prepared to strike the dragon's belly with its other arm, Bahamut suddenly dived in and locked his jaws around the monster's wrist, yanking it up. Now both dragons worked together to lift the beast up into the air. The 2 dragons carried Weapon up and up, higher than the high wind, and even higher than the rugged mountains that bordered the Corel Plains. Cloud, Yuffie, and Red 13, carried by Chaos back onto the high wind before the summoning of Neo Bahamut, watched in wide-eyed fascination, unable to believe the overwhelming power that the Bahamut dragons held. The dragons carried Weapon higher and then, when they could lift the beast no further, they let go. Weapon fell from the sky. Its arms trailed uselessly behind it, unable to do anything to stop itself from plummeting to the ground. A loud rumble, much like the roll of thunder, filled the air. Ruby Weapon's good eye flicked towards the ground that was zooming in rapidly. The sand was rising, swelling upwards as something large and powerful began to make its way out from deep beneath the surface of the planet. Eventually the sand fell away, revealing the being that Red 13 had summoned to help deliver the final touches to this battle with Ruby Weapon, Titan. Titan stepped out of the sand and looked up. Weapon was descending rapidly, heading straight for him. Titan clenched his enormous fist and swung it upward just as Weapon came within range. There was a loud thwack as Titan's fist connected with Weapon's head. His fist shattered the armor protecting Weapon's head, and pieces of broken metal fell in all directions. Titan raised his other fist and delivered a second crushing blow to Weapon's torso, sending the beast flying across the sand. Weapon landed heavily and rolled across the sand. More plates of metal broke away from its body as it rolled over and over. Finally it came to a stop. It lay in the sand, its body twitching. Overhead, the two dragons circled the skies. As Ruby Weapon started to climb to its feet, the dragons took up positions on either side of the battlefield and prepared to deliver the final blow. Each dragon opened his mouth. A glow began to form in the reaches of their throats, as the dragons began to draw up on the energy within them to unleash upon Weapon. Their heads quivered as the energy grew stronger, until the very air around them began to waver. When they had finally drawn up enough energy, the two dragons roared and unleashed their attacks together. Two brilliant beams of light burst from the open mouths of the two dragons. Like lasers they fired down towards the ground, so intense and powerful the air practically vibrated with the concentration of energy. One beam zipped past the high wind and sent it reeling sideways. Those standing on the high wind's deck almost fell off the airship, and had to hold onto the railing. The two beams continued on past the airship until they struck Weapon with full force. The explosion that followed was so powerful that it sent a shockwave of hot air and sand hurtling in all directions. It was visible even from the gold saucer, where Dio was still watching the battle unfold. It would be discovered later that the shockwave spread out in a radius of at least 10 miles, and more powerful than any Mako bomb Shinra had developed. The high wind was caught up in the blast. It spun out of control as Sid failed to keep a hold on it, and tumbled rapidly towards the ground. The airship was caught by Titan moments before it could hit the ground. Titan held onto the airship until the winds passed and the air became calm once again. The sand began to settle. Everyone on the high wind, those in and out, watched in silent anticipation. Even the dragons remained still, their eyes fixed on the sand. There was movement within the sand. A large shadow rose up out of the raining sand, and for a brief moment everybody's hearts sank in dismay. Weapon stepped out of the sand. It was still standing. Weapon's body had been severely damaged by the blast. Most of its armor had now broken away, and the flesh that had been left bare was charred and black. Liquid Mako was oozing out of the many wounds that had opened up all over its body. The monster opened its mouth to roar, but only a hoarse whisper came out. Its mouth fell open, and more Mako seeped out from between its jaws. Red 13 finally dared to rise to his feet and peered out over the deck.
Is it defeated?
He asked. Nobody answered him, their eyes were fixed on Weapon. As they all watched, tendrils of steam began to slowly rise from Weapon's body. The monster gave another strangled roar before its head fell back and its eye fixed blankly on the overhead sky. The two dragons, seeing that they were no longer needed, glowed white before vanishing into thin air. Titan released the airship, and he too vanished. The steam rose faster, growing thicker. More tendrils, the same color as the Mako that dripped from its mouth and wounds, also began to rise into the air. Ruby Weapon's broken body began to glow brightly before abruptly vanishing, returning Weapon to the planet from where it was born. There was a long moment of silence following the demise of Ruby Weapon. Cloud let out a long sigh. Behind him, Yuffie dropped to her knees. Though they had fought many difficult battles during the course of their journey, including against the inhuman Genova, this had been one of the most terrifying. This had been a creature created by the planet itself, specifically designed to destroy all threats to the planet. And yet they had won. It also proved one thing: the weapons were not indestructible. It was possible to defeat them, though it would take all the powers the planet had to offer to do it. Cloud turned from the battlefield and leaned against the rails. His hands were trembling, his heart racing in his chest. They had defeated Weapon. They were strong enough to defeat Weapon. And if they were strong enough to defeat Weapon, then they were strong enough to face their ultimate enemy, Sephiroth. The swordsman gripped the railings tight, forcing the shaking of his hands to cease. When he was sure he had control of himself again, he pushed himself away from the rails and strode across the deck. Stopping by the door, he looked back over his shoulder.
Come on, he said coolly, we've wasted enough time here. Let's get going.
End of chapter. Episode 29, Part 13, Chapter 27. Chapter 27. The rest of their flight to the northern continent was quiet. No other weapons showed up, and there also wasn't any sign of Shinra, which was an added bonus. Kat reported that all was quiet in Shinra at the moment, with all the suits including Rufus at a loss of what to do. Their attempt to destroy Meteor had failed miserably. In Midgar, fear was swiftly turning to panic. The company was tied up just keeping the citizens in line to worry about anything else. It was unlikely that Shinra would try to come after them now, so they were free to do almost anything they wanted. They parked the Highwind outside of the forest that led to Bone Village. Kat offered to lead the way, but they all remembered the cat's last attempt, and so they declined. They reached the village in good time and headed into the sleeping forest. They had no choice but to walk the long trek through the forest. The Forgotten City lay deep within the mountains, at the end of a long, narrow path. With the sleeping forest and the rugged ground, it was impossible for the Highwind to take them any nearer. If they had chocobos, the trek would have been easier, but they had no time to go out and catch one. With Meteor drawing ever closer, time was of the essence. Red 13 stayed close to his grandfather during their long trek through the now awakened sleeping forest. He didn't say it out loud, but he was worried about Bugenhagen. In his youth, Bugenhagen must have made many journeys like this, and seen much of the world. But he was not so young now, and the hound feared for his health. Bugenhagen, though, would only scold him teasingly if he spoke up, and so the hound kept his worries to himself. His eyes, however, stayed on Bugenhagen. The old man did not seem to be at all fazed by the long walk through the forest. In fact, he felt energized, more than he had felt in a long time. He looked around at the sleeping forest with fascination, taking in every sight and sound, scent and touch. He was forming his own theories as to why the forest was able to go to sleep, theories he shared quite willingly with the others. Every so often he would spot a plant or tree that he had not seen outside of his library and wander off to examine it. And, every so often, Cloud had to go after him and usher him along. They came out of the sleeping forest and approached the Forgotten City. A somber silence fell over the group as they neared it. Even Bugenhagen fell silent. They entered the city. Nothing had changed. The Forgotten City was exactly as it had been the day they first came here, that ill-fated day when Eris lost her life to Sephiroth. There were the same broken-down buildings, the same 3 paths leading into each part of the city. The left path went deeper into the city, while the right one led into the mountains. It was the central path that they took. This path led to the Forgotten City's last and biggest secret, the true entrance to the City of the Ancients. As before, the entrance remained unchanged. The giant shell stood tall by the shore of the lake, surrounded by the same eerie, glowing trees. The lake's surface was perfectly still, for not a breath of wind blew in this place. Though they tried not to look at it, their eyes were drawn to the water. One by one their heads turned and gazed into the shallow, crystal-clear water. Their reflections gazed back at them, unwavering. In the middle of the lake the water became deeper and darker. It was there that Cloud had brought Eris after her death. They all remembered those final moments when Cloud lowered her gently into the water to begin her journey back to the planet. It was the last they ever saw of her. She had seemed so peaceful after her death. It was a cliché thought, but they had all truly felt as though Eris had not died, but had simply fallen into a long sleep. Of course they knew that was not true. Eris was dead, and there was no changing that fact. Her sleep was that of death, and her lively, smiling face was forever lost except in their memories of her. Those memories had all resurfaced now, as plain and clear as their reflections in the water. Yet even in death, the ancient appeared to have a level of influence over them. Remembering her, they could not be sad for long. The words and feelings that she had left behind. One by one the others smiled to themselves and turned their eyes back to the building. The only one who didn't smile was Cloud. Unlike the others, he could not bring himself to smile when he thought of Eris. All he could feel was the pain and the guilt her loss brought to him. He had been unable to save her. He would have killed her himself if the others had not stopped him. How could he smile in memory of her, when he was in part to blame for her death? Would she ever forgive him? Cloud tore his eyes away from the water. There would be time to think about that another time, after this was all over. Until then there were other things to think about. He focused his mind on these, and followed his friends into the building. Unfortunately, they were not able to reach the real city of the ancients. The radiant blue staircase that led underground to the real city was no longer there. It had vanished, as though it had never existed. All that was left was the spiral slope leading up to, well, nothing. It was only Ares' presence that had revealed the stairway before, and now that there were no Cetra left in the world, that doorway would remain sealed forever. Cloud wasn't too disappointed of that. At least this way, he told himself, the secrets of the ancients would remain secret. They left the giant shell and returned to the main city. For a while they wandered until they came upon something that they had missed during their first exploration of the city. It was an audience chamber of sorts, quite expertly hidden behind one of the shell-like buildings that lay in ruins on the west side of the city. The chamber was carved into the side of the rising cliffs and had no roof, its entirety was left open to the elements. It rose in 3 tiers, with a stone staircase linking the upper and central tiers. The stairs leading to the lower tier had long since broken away. The shadow of the cliff blocked out most of the sunlight, and yet the chamber was filled with light. The light was coming from a pillar standing in the middle of the chamber, and it was here that Bugenhagen's eyes were drawn.
This is...
The pillar was about 25 feet high, as high as the platform of the upper tier. A large stone slab rested on the very top of the pillar, surrounded by a barrier of winding stone branches. Standing in the middle of the slab was a dais made of what looked like coral. Its branches curved and wound around the biggest crystal Cloud had ever seen, resting in the dais. It was this crystal that was emitting the light, filling the chamber with a cool, gentle light.
Yes. Exactly.
Bugenhagen left Cloud and the others and floated forward. He passed over the edge of the upper platform and, as was his usual strange manner, floated high in the air and approached the glowing crystal. He came to a stop beside the wall of branches, peering through them to look at the crystal. Cloud walked to the top of the staircase that led down to the central tier. He looked up at Bugenhagen.
Are you getting anything?
He asked. His voice seemed too loud for this room, breaking the calm silence. Bugenhagen leaned forward, trying to peer through the branches. He spotted an opening on the other side, where the pillar was connected to the upper tiers by a sloping stone path.
Give me a moment,
the old man replied. He began to float around the perimeter of the pillar, heading for the opening. When he reached it, he entered the barrier and moved close to the crystal. With nothing left to do but wait, the companions separated. They settled in various places throughout the hall. Vincent and Sid kept watch at the chamber's entrance, talking together in low voices. Barrett paced about impatiently along the central tier, unable to relax even though the city was completely silent. Yuffie sat down at the top of the stairs and played with a ball of materia absently, bored. Cat Shi sat near her and polished his megaphone vigorously. Cloud walked slowly along the upper tier. His eyes scanned the chamber, taking it all in. The chamber itself was not that large, it would have struggled to hold even 50 people, unless they were all packed together. There were no seats and no doors, except for the darkened hollows carved into the walls of each tier. He guessed that the Forgotten City must have had a small population even in its prime, so long ago. He turned his attention back to the center of the room. Red 13 was sitting silently at the edge of the stone slab, watching as Bugenhagen worked his way around the dais, examining the crystal. Tifa stood on the edge of the path that connected the pillar to the upper tier, also watching. She looked up as she heard Cloud approach, and moved out of the way to allow him to pass. As though sensing Cloud's presence behind him, Bugenhagen straightened and turned.
The knowledge of the ancients swirling around here is telling me one thing, said the old man, stroking his beard. The planet's in a crisis.
He shook his head sadly.
A crisis beyond human power or endless time. It says, when the time comes, we must search for Holy.
Holy? Asked Cloud. Behind him, the others shared glances with each other. One by one they shrugged or shook their heads. They didn't know anything, either.
Holy. The ultimate white magic,
explained Bugenhagen.
Magic that might stand against Meteor. Perhaps our best hope to save the planet from Meteor.
The old man looked up at the sky.
If a soul-seeking Holy reaches the planet, it will appear. Ho ho ho. Meteor, weapon, everything will disappear. Perhaps even ourselves.
Cloud's eyes widened.
Even us?
He asked in alarm. The others began to shift about uncomfortably, not liking the sound of that. They all kept their eyes on Bugenhagen, white and fearful. Bugenhagen stroked his beard again.
It is up to the planet to decide,
he said simply. He then floated up above the crystal and looked around into the pale, worried faces of Cloud's companions.
What is best for the planet? What is bad for the planet? All that is bad will disappear. That is all. Ho ho ho.
He chucked.
I wonder which we humans are.
Cloud lowered his head. If they did nothing, meteor would collide with the planet and everything would be destroyed, including them. If they did as Bugenhagen suggested and summoned Holy, both meteor and the weapons would vanish, along with anything the planet decided would do it harm. Suppose the planet decided that it was better off without humans? If they summoned Holy, they could end up destroying themselves anyway. Was that a gamble really worth taking? Cloud looked up at the sky. Meteor was only just visible over the cliffs. It had grown a little larger, he felt, since they left Cosmo Canyon. He thought back to Shinra's attempt to destroy Meteor. Even with all their technology and weapon advancement, they had been unable to destroy it. Perhaps the only option left to save them and the planet was to call forth Holy. The more he thought about it, the more obvious the answer became. Holy was the only chance the planet had left for survival. Even if they were destroyed along with Meteor, at least the planet would be safe. His thoughts went back to Eris and recalled once more the last words she had spoken to him. Had she known about Holy? Was summoning Holy what she had planned to do to save the planet from Meteor? He started to wonder.
Search for Holy,
he said finally. He looked up at Bugenhagen.
How do we do it?
A small smile spread on Bugenhagen's face. The old man had known Cloud would make the right choice.
Speak to the planet, he said to them.
Get the white materia.
This will bond the planet to humans.
Then speak to the planet. If our wish reaches the planet, the white materia will begin to glow a pale green.
The white materia. As Cloud thought about it, Eris's image returned to his mind. She was in the sleeping forest, running towards the forgotten city. Her hair, tied in a pink ribbon, swung behind her. And there, nestled in the ribbon, was that tiny ball of useless materia that she always carried with her. The materia that was a gift from her mother, the one she said she had never been able to use. Eris must have realized it when they were at the Temple of the Ancients. Standing in the presence of the black materia, she must have finally realized what her materia was, and what it did. That was why she had gone to the Forgotten City, where the power of the Ancients was the strongest. She had gone to summon Holy. But she never succeeded. Sephiroth had seen to that.
This is the end,
said Cloud. He looked up at Bugenhagen.
Eris had the white materia. But when Eris died, it fell from the altar.
He shook his head, looked at the ground.
That's why. This is the end. Ho ho ho. Ho ho ho.
Cloud raised his head and looked up at Bugenhagen again. He was shocked, for the old man was actually laughing. The old man's face was creased into a large smile as he chuckled to himself. Catching Cloud's glare, Bugenhagen turned and floated down to rejoin Cloud and the others.
Ho ho ho.
He chuckled.
Look at this.
He gestured to the stone slab on which the dais rested. Cloud followed his gesture and looked down. For a moment he saw nothing, but then his eyes widened. He exclaimed. At first glance, he had thought the slab was nothing more than that, a slab of stone. But looking at it for a second time, he saw that there were images carved into the stone, circling the dais. Cloud hadn't noticed before, but there was a walkway made of blue crystal along the inside of the slab. The images were on this walkway, too, glowing eerily. Though the pictures must have been years old, perhaps hundreds of years old, it was still clear.
Ancients' writing,
said Bugenhagen, answering Cloud's thoughts. Cloud gazed down at the pictures. So this was the writing of the ancients. He looked up at Bugenhagen, his eyes hopeful.
Can you read it?
He asked. Bugenhagen placed his hands on his hips.
I can't even make it out. This is no time for jokes,
said Cloud sourly.
I'm not an ancient. I can't read this thing.
Bugenhagen protested. He floated past Cloud and read 13, moving slowly around the crystal.
I may be old,
he added,
but my eyes aren't completely bad yet.
He came to a stop at the side of the crystal and pointed down.
Look closely below the writing.
Cloud followed Bugenhagen's finger and looked at the writing at the base of the dais. At first he saw nothing, but then he stopped and leaned over. There were more words scribbled beneath the writings of the ancients. They were smaller and fainter, as though someone had written them in a great hurry, but they were definitely written in the common tongue. They were years old, though not as old as the ancients' writing. The words were faded in places, but some bits were still readable.
There's something written in chalk.
Cloud knelt down and brushed away a layer of dust and dirt that had built up over the words, allowing him to read them clearer.
Even sunlight can't reach. Key. It was probably written by a scientist who's been here,
said Bugenhagen, stroking his beard.
He probably used up all his energy to make out these 2 words.
Cloud looked down at the writing again. The words did indeed look as though they had been written with great effort. It was likely that the scientist who wrote them had been at the end of his funds or supplies and was desperate to make one last attempt at deciphering the ancient's words before being forced to head back home. Either that or something else came up to distract him from his work. But there were other questions on Cloud's mind as he looked at the writing.
Key.
He looked up at Bugenhagen again.
To what? I don't know,
Bugenhagen admitted.
But, it'll probably have something to do with our riddle.
The old man twirled the ends of his beard between his fingers.
The riddle? Then it must have something to do with Eris.
Cloud rose to his feet. He crossed his arms and tapped his foot, thinking hard.
So this note points to where the key is,
he surmised.
Probably.
The old man stopped playing with his beard and floated up above the crystal. Without looking at Cloud, he said,
Use these words as clues and go find the key. I'll continue to figure out the ancient's writing.
Go find the key. That was easier said than done. Cloud wished that the scientist who deciphered those words had managed to do a little more.
A place, even sunlight can't reach, is where the key is, right?
Bugenhagen nodded.
When you find the key, or when you can't go any further, come back here.
He looked back at the writing that circled the dais.
Maybe I'll understand more from the writing and get some new information from you.
Cloud thought for a moment. It was not much of a hint, but it was as good a start as any, he supposed. Besides, there were other places he could try for information. He looked at Cat Shi, still polishing his megaphone next to Yuffie. The cat looked up at him and tilted his head, confused. Maybe the cat, with his inside connections in Shinra, would be able to help them discover what the key was and where it was hidden. After all, Shinra had spent many long years studying the ancients. It was entirely possible that they had information on this key. All that was left for them to do now was to return to the Highwind and find it. Cloud nodded firmly. Just as they were leaving, Red 13 announced that he would be staying behind. He did not want to leave Bugenhagen alone, he said. Cloud guessed that was not the whole reason. He believed that the Hound was still feeling guilty over going berserk during their battle with Ruby Weapon. He wanted to redeem himself. Bugenhagen, though, objected, stating that there was no danger in the Forgotten City. Red 13 would be of the best use if he continued to travel with his friends and help them to find the key. The Hound tried to object, but Bugenhagen was adamant. In the end, Red 13 left the Forgotten City with Cloud and the others. They headed back to the Highwind, to begin their search for the key of the ancients. End of chapter. Episode 30, Part 13, Chapter 28. Chapter 28.
What you gonna do, Cloud?
Asked Barrett.
Got any good ideas?
The companions were back on the Highwind. The airship was flying low over the shores of the northern continent, while they spent some time thinking about where to go first. Cloud stood by the window watching the waves as they broke on the sand. He didn't know where to begin. A place even sunlight can't reach is where the key is. What place was like that? Perhaps it was in a cave, or under the ground, or even under the ocean. More importantly, what did this key look like? The ocean. That reminded Cloud of something else that they still needed to collect. The huge materia from the underwater reactor at Jinan should still be in the Shinra sub. They were forced to leave it at the bottom of the ocean when they had to hurry to Jinan Airport to stop the airship carrying the last piece from leaving. They never had a chance to go back and collect it, and since the attack on Meteor had failed, it was unlikely that Shinra had bothered to go down and get it. So he instructed the Highwind's crew to head south, to Jinan. Cat reported that Shinra's presence there was down to a minimum, and so they did not bother to hide the Highwind this time. They landed the airship right in the open, by the alcove where they had hidden the Shinra submarine that they captured. Thankfully, the sub was exactly where they had left it. Leaving the crew in charge of the airship, they boarded the sub and headed down into the ocean. It did not take them long to find the submarine, 20 minutes at most. As they had expected, the sub lay undisturbed at the bottom of the ocean. It was nestled in a pile of rocks and would have been invisible if it did not stick out like a sore red thumb among the great and lifeless rocks around it. They could not help but wince when they saw the damage they had caused. There were 2 large holes in the side of the submarine where the torpedoes had ripped through the engines. The hatch on the top of the submarine had broken open when it crashed into the rock, which would make their retrieval of the huge materia an easier task. All power in the sub had long since died, leaving the vessel eerie and dark. Sitting in the pilot seat, Cloud brought their submarine to a stop 10 meters from the vessel. Its dark, lifeless image filled the screen.
So this is the leader sub,
he said. Looking at the charred, black metal, he grimaced.
Damn. Makes me sick just thinking about it.
He guided the submarine forward, bringing it around so that it floated just above the open hatch of the sunken ship. The inside of the sub was pitch black except for a tiny glow that was their target. Tifa, sitting at the left-hand console, activated the submarine's retrieval program. There was a hum from below as the hatch opened in the belly of their sub. A metallic claw and arm descended and disappeared inside the sunken submarine. A few moments later it rose again, with the huge materia resting snugly in the claw's fingers. Once the arm was back inside their sub, the hatch closed, and the onboard computer beeped as it made its analysis of their prize.
Huge materia recovered,
the computer announced once its analysis was complete.
No damage appears to have been sustained. Phew,
said Cloud with a sigh.
That's good to hear.
Vincent and Kat left the bridge to retrieve the huge materia. Cloud figured they would place it with the other 3 pieces once they had finished what they needed to do in the Forgotten City and took Bugenhagen home to Cosmo Canyon. Until then they would have to keep it with them. Tifa slipped the sonar headphones off her head and turned in her chair to look at Cloud.
So what now?
She asked.
Have you had any ideas?
Cloud sat back in his chair, his fingers drumming absently against the arm. In truth, he had not been able to come up with a single idea. The key was probably hidden in a cave, but they didn't have the time to travel to every cave in the world. For a moment Cloud had a nasty thought that the key was hidden in the Temple of the Ancients. If that was the case, then it was gone forever, and all would be lost. During their flight to Junon, he had cornered Kat and asked him for his thoughts, but the cat had said he did not know either. All of Shinra's files on the Ancients were closely protected and very few had access. Someone in his position, Kat had said, would not be able to gain access to them. Still, the cat promised that he would try, and that he would let Cloud know if he found out anything.
Well, I have an idea.
Cloud turned in his chair. The cat must have some sixth sense, he thought, for he had no sooner thought of Kat before he re-entered the room, with Vincent behind him. In the cat's paws was the last of the huge materia. It was at least half the size of him and must have been heavy, but the cat carried it without difficulty and took it over to Cloud. The swordsman took it from him, looked at it for a moment, and then placed it gently in his lap.
You said you had an idea,
he prompted. The cat tilted his head, confused.
Hey? Oh, that.
He turned and climbed up onto an empty chair so the others could see him better. Finding the chair a little uncomfortable, the cat tried to soften the leather by pushing down on it with his paws. Sid tapped his spear impatiently on the floor as they waited for the cat to finish. Once he was sat comfortably, the cat turned to look up at his friends, smiling.
Well, this is just a rumor, he began, but I heard that there is a cave somewhere on the western continent that can only be reached by a submarine, or a chocobo that can cross mountains. It was discovered quite a long time ago by a professor who was doing intensive research into the mysteries of the planet.
Really? Asked Tifa curiously.
Who was that?
Cat scratched his chin.
I don't know. His name has been erased from the records. I'm sure that someone like Heidegger or Scarlet or even Hojo would know. But,
he added quickly, before anyone could interrupt,
what I do know is that this cave has been closely linked to the planet and the Cetra. And a cave is a place that sunlight can't reach. Perhaps the key is there.
Sid raised an eyebrow.
You really think it's there? It's a place to start,
the cat replied with a shrug.
However, since we don't have a chocobo handy, the only way we can get to this cave is by using this sub.
Tifa turned to Cloud.
What do you think, Cloud?
She asked. The swordsman did not reply right away. He looked down at the huge materia he held in his hands, turning it over slowly. It wasn't that he did not trust Kat's information, but there was something in the manner that the cat had suddenly offered this information that made him feel a little uneasy. Even so, he couldn't deny the plausibility in Kat's argument. If this cave was linked to the ancients in some way, then it was certainly worth checking.
All right,
he said finally.
We'll go there first. Do you know the way? When have I ever let you down?
Said the cat cheerfully, rising to his feet. He patted his chest.
You drive the sub and I'll lead the way. Now then, away we go.
Kat's directions were right on the mark. He led them to an underwater tunnel that was partially hidden in the walls of the tall ocean cliffs that bordered the western continent. The wall of one of the cliffs was almost covering the entrance, making it easy to miss. It was only by chance they spotted it when a fish appeared to disappear behind the wall. They turned the sub around and entered the tunnel. It was narrow inside the tunnel, at least in the beginning. It widened out after about 10 meters, giving them room to move. The lamps on the front of the sub lit up the darkness of the tunnel, meaning they could move without fear of slamming into the walls. Still, it was very dark, and so they slowed down and moved cautiously. The tunnel generally moved in a straight line, heading deep beneath the western continent. After a couple of miles, the tunnel made a gentle curve to move further and further away from the ocean. Just when they thought that the tunnel was never going to end, a light appeared in the distance. It was a small, faint light that grew brighter as they approached it. Realizing that this light was, in fact, sunlight, they picked up the pace and hurried towards the tunnel exit. The tunnel came out at the bottom of a large lake in the middle of a beautiful valley. The valley was surrounded on all sides by mountains so tall and treacherous that, like Kat said, it would have been impossible to reach it on foot. Only by traversing the underwater tunnels like they did, or by riding on a chocobo that could ride through mountains, could anybody reach it. The valley itself was beautiful, another of those rare places where Shinra's influence had not reached. The grass grew freely all over the valley, thick and vibrant, with no traces of blackness or decay. The air did not have the choking scent of machinery, but was clean, crisp, and refreshing. It was not hard to see why the researcher who had discovered this place felt that it was connected to the planet. The wonders of the planet were around them in abundance. They docked the airship as close to the shore of the lake as they could, before climbing out and jumping down into the water. The water was cool and revitalizing, and incredibly clear. The cave that Kat had spoken of was on the western part of the clearing. It was hidden behind a large waterfall that spilled out of a gap between two rising cliffs. In fact, they almost missed it during their search. It was Yuffie who found it, as she ran barefoot through the water with Red 13, trying to splash him with water. When she saw it, she stopped and called the others over, and together they entered the cave. It was very dark inside the cave. The waterfall blocked out most of the sunlight, and it wasn't long before they were walking in what was almost total darkness. Their hopes rose as they thought that maybe this was the place that the riddle had spoken of. The deeper they went into the cave, the quieter the roar of the waterfall became, until it was nothing more than a dull roar in the background. The only other sound was their footsteps, echoing quietly around them. After a few minutes walking down a lengthy passageway, the cave widened out into a cavern. The companions piled in and then stopped, looking around in awe. Their eyes were immediately drawn to a great crystal edifice at the far end of the cave. It rested silently in the middle of a large, shallow pool, with numerous branches growing out in all directions around a single pillar in the center. The whole crystal structure was glistening as though covered with a thin film of water, and shimmered with an unearthly white light. Tiny droplets of water dripped from the edge of the branches, the only things to disturb the stillness of the pool. The companions separated and spread out, examining the rest of the cave. They had no idea what exactly they were looking for. If this was the cave the riddle had spoken of, then they should find something that resembled a key somewhere. While the others searched under rocks and dug about in crevices, Vincent walked slowly along the edge of the pool. He raised his eyes and looked up at the crystal. The aura of light that the crystal emitted was the only light in the whole cavern. He stood watching it for a moment, before he turned to help the others with the search.
Vincent!
Vincent stopped, his head snapped around.
That voice!
The gunman turned back to the crystal, his eyes wide.
It can't be.
Vincent turned and looked over his shoulder. The others were still looking about the cave. It didn't seem as though they had heard the voice. Vincent returned his attention to the crystal. The voice had come from that crystal, of that he was sure. He gazed up at it curiously. Something moved within the crystal. Vincent started to reach for his gun but was stopped as a bright light suddenly erupted from the crystal and filled the cavern. The others, their attention drawn by this sudden burst of light, cried out and covered their eyes. Only Vincent stood firm, staring directly into the light. A silhouette flickered over the crystal. The shadow then descended leisurely onto the surface of the pool and settled there. The light then receded, revealing a woman who had until then been sleeping unseen within the confines of the crystal. The woman knelt on the pool's surface, head lowered, staring into the water. Upon seeing this woman, a wave of chill darkness almost overcame him. Black spots danced in front of his eyes, and his legs turned to jelly. Fighting to stay conscious, the gunman closed his hand tightly around his gun. The pain of the metal digging into his flesh fought back the faintness and brought back some semblance of coherence to his startled mind. When he spoke, his voice was dry and harsh.
Lucretia.
The woman stirred at the sound of his voice. She knelt at the foot of the crystal, bathed in its white light. She was clothed in a long, white dress made out of silk. It fitted smoothly around her slender form, falling in gentle folds around her ankles. Hearing Vincent's voice, she raised her head. She had a smooth, beautiful face, and a head of long brown hair that was tied up in a long ponytail, though some loose strands fell elegantly around her face. Her dark brown eyes gazed up at Vincent in confusion, as though he was not really there.
Vincent. Lucretia.
Vincent could not believe his eyes. It was her. It was Lucretia. She was alive. His heart racing, he headed towards the pool. The woman's eyes cleared. She saw Vincent approaching her. Suddenly, her face twisted in pain and grief. She tore her eyes away from him and thrust her hand out in front of her, to stop him from getting close.
Stay back!
She shouted. It had been many long years since he and Lucretia first met. It was about 30 years, in fact, though neither of them looked even a day older than they did then. That was all thanks to Shinra and their secret experiments, though Vincent would not learn the true depth of those experiments for another few years, when the truth of the days he had spent with Lucretia and Professor Hojo came to light. In those days, Vincent Valentine had been a member of the Turks. He had been sent to Shinra Manor in Nibelheim to be the bodyguard of one of Shinra's young but brilliant scientists, Dr. Lucretia Crescent. Dr. Crescent had been stationed in Nibelheim alongside Professor Gast and Professor Hojo, aiding them with their research on the planet and the ancients. Vincent had not known the full content of their research, only that it involved the study of an ancient that had been discovered on the northern continent. The specimen had been brought from the northern continent and stored at the Mako reactor at Mount Nebel for safekeeping, though that knowledge had been carefully kept from the townspeople. Those old days brought back many memories. Watching as Professors Gast and Hojo, along with Lucretia, walked up to Shinra Manor that was the base of all their research. In time, as he and Lucretia grew to know one another, they would take regular walks through the town and admire the beautiful landscape. Lucretia would talk often about her work, her theories, anything that came into her mind. Vincent, in turn, would listen to her talk, taking in every word. It was only natural that he would come to love her. Lucretia bright and intelligent, and so kind in her ways that falling in love with her was almost inevitable. She always greeted him with a smile, and when they spoke she always looked directly into his eyes. In his heart Vincent was thankful to Shinra that he had been assigned to protect her. He wanted to carry on protecting her. Always. One day, he finally made up his mind to tell her that. He approached her and, plucking up every ounce of courage he had, he asked for her hand. The reaction he received was not what he expected. Lucretia's face, always full of smiles and laughter, suddenly shattered like glass. Tears came into her eyes and rolled unchecked down her cheeks. Without saying a word she turned and ran from him, crying and shaking her head. Vincent did not go after her. He simply watched, confused by her tears, as Lucretia ran as fast as she could away from him. He saw Lucretia again that very same day. She had been by the town entrance with Professor Hojo, though neither seemed to be aware that Vincent was nearby. As Vincent watched, Lucretia suddenly fell into the professor's arms, holding him close. Hojo, in turn, put his arms around her, a smile on his face. Vincent stood and watched them for a moment, before he turned and walked away.
If she is happy then, I don't mind.
Unbeknownst to Vincent, Lucretia was not happy. Torn apart by her decisions, she spent many hours pacing in her room at Nibelheim Inn. She would stop only to grab her head with her hands, tug at her hair, and cry to herself. Yet despite her pain she would always return to Hojo's side, her face cold, and her eyes flat like glass. It was on one such day, when Hojo and Lucretia were together in the professor's office, that Vincent confronted them. He had heard from one of the other researchers staying at the manor that Hojo and Lucretia were going to use the cells of the ancient stored at the Mako reactor in a human experiment, one that would create a human with the extraordinary powers of the ancients. Professor Hojo, he had heard, had drawn up the plans for that experiment. And that Dr. Crescent Lucretia had offered herself to be the mother of that child.
I'm against it.
Vincent had shouted at the two.
Why experiment on humans?
Lucretia remained silent, she refused to even look at him. Professor Hojo, on the other hand, sighed heavily and spoke as though he was speaking to a child.
She and I are both scientists,
he said. Vincent had argued long and hard, but his words fell on deaf ears. Professor Hojo refused to listen to him. Even Lucretia stubbornly refused to listen, determined to continue with the experiment regardless of the risks, or what Vincent or anyone else said to try and stop her. She was sure, she had said. In the end, the experiment went ahead. Vincent did nothing else to try and talk Lucretia out of it. He simply stood by and watched as Professor Hojo and Lucretia worked to gather the required cells from Genova, the ancient that lay sleeping in the Mako reactor. Once the cells were ready, those cells were injected into Lucretia and into her unborn child.
After that, a child was born to Lucretia. That child's name is Sephiroth.
It happened a few days after the birth of her child. Lucretia was alone in her room at the inn. She was pacing the room as she always did, her face carrying that worn, weary look that had become customary in the months leading up to her child's birth. She crossed the room and headed to the window to look out at the town. Suddenly, a sharp, stabbing pain ripped through her lower abdomen. Lucretia cried out and fell to her knees, clutching at her stomach. The pain was intense, burning. She tried to stand, but her strength gave out and she fell face down onto the wooden floor. There she lay, twitching, before her body became still and she moved no more. When Vincent heard what had happened, he was livid. He confronted Hojo in his lab, demanding that he answer for what he did to Lucretia. Hojo, in his temper, drew out a gun and shot Vincent in the chest. The Turk staggered back, startled, and then fell to the ground. Hojo stood over him, the gun still in his hand, laughing triumphantly. Shortly afterward, Professor Hojo had Vincent's unconscious body strapped to a table. The wound in his shoulder was bad, but luckily for him it was not fatal. Hojo stood at his side, hard at work, with a scalpel in his hand. There was a wicked smile on the professor's face as he worked, picking up a syringe and slowly injecting its contents into the wounded Turk's left arm. Putting it down, the professor picked up a second, and injected the contents of that one also. Vincent came to a few hours later. He was alone in the laboratory, Professor Hojo had gone. The Turk sat up slowly. A wave of dizziness and nausea overcame him as he moved, and put his hand to his head. He waited until the dizziness passed before he climbed off the table, standing on his 2 feet. His legs wobbled, and he almost found himself on the floor again. In an attempt to keep himself from falling, he reached out to grab hold of the table. Suddenly, Vincent stopped and stared down at his hand. Feeling suddenly cold, the Turk raised his other hand and looked at that, too. It was the same. His hands were strange, bizarre, inhuman. Unable to fight the rising panic, the Turk raised his arms into the air.
Urgh!
He cried, his voice garbled and monstrous. That was the last thing he remembered, before his vision went dark once more.
This body is the punishment that's been given to me. I was unable to stop them. All that I was able to do was watch. That is my punishment.
Vincent stopped a few feet from the edge of the pool. Seeing that he had stopped, Lucretia slowly lowered her hand. She brought it close to her chest, resting it over her heart. Her face was marked by sorrow and anguish, which only increased when she raised her eyes and looked up at Vincent, standing before her. Though Cloud and the others now stood around him, awestruck by Lucretia's sudden appearance, Vincent did not pay them any heed. All of his thoughts, his feelings, they were all on the woman who knelt before him now. The woman he had thought to be dead all of this time. Lucretia Crescent.
Lucretia?
He breathed, in wonder.
You're alive.
Lucretia's eyes filled again as she heard Vincent speak her name. She clasped her fingers tightly in the folds of her dress and looked away from him, full of shame.
I wanted to disappear,
she said softly.
I couldn't be with anyone. I wanted to die. But the Genova inside me wouldn't let me die.
Lucretia paused and took a shaky breath. Vincent watched her in silence, unable to say a word. Even the others, standing around him, were perfectly silent. When she had recovered her composure, Lucretia continued.
Lately, I dream a lot about Sephiroth. My dear, dear child. Ever since he was born I never got to hold him, even once. Not even once. You can't call me his mother. That,
she said, after a moment's hesitation,
is my sin.
Her voice broke, and she raised her fingers to her lips as she fought back a sob. Vincent took a step towards her, thinking to console her. Seeing him move, Lucretia quickly thrust out her hand again.
Back!
She shouted.
Stay back!
Vincent did as he was told and stopped, right at the edge of the pool. The tip of his boots touched the water, sending a small, minor ripple across its surface. Lucretia caught sight of the movement and watched silently as that ripple moved past her knees, stopping at the edge of the crystal. Her fingers ceased trembling. Carefully, she rose to her feet, standing just above the surface of the pool. Finally, she raised her head without fear and looked Vincent in his red eyes.
Vincent,
she said.
Won't you please tell me?
Vincent looked back at her, confused.
What? If Sephiroth is still alive?
Lucretia took a half step forward, and her feet made another ripple in the pool surface, heading for Vincent.
I heard that he died 5 years ago. But I see him in my dreams so often. And I know that physically, like myself, he can't die so easily. Please, Vincent,
she begged.
Tell me.
Vincent did not answer straight away. Behind him, Cloud stepped forward, preparing to tell her the truth about her dear child. Seeing Cloud move, Vincent turned and thrust out his arm. Cloud stopped in his tracks and stared at the gunman in surprise. Vincent's eyes were firm, their message clear. It was he and he alone who could answer Lucretia. It was up to him to tell her what she needed to hear, so that she would be able to rest in peace. Vincent lowered his arm and turned back to Lucretia. She looked back at him with her face in earnest, her eyes filled with tears.
Lucretia?
He paused. He looked directly into her eyes, his face impassive.
Sephiroth is dead.
As Vincent said those words, Lucretia's face fell. She looked down into the water. A single, solitary tear rolled down her cheek. It dripped off her chin and splashed into the water, creating another ripple. A gentle white light radiated from the crystal behind her. The light wrapped itself around Lucretia's body, drawing her into it. When the light faded, Lucretia was inside the crystal once more. Her hands were clasped gently over her chest and her eyes were closed, as though in sleep. Vincent gazed up at the crystal, his eyes on Lucretia. Unable to die, she had said. Because of the Genova cells living inside her. That was why she had sealed herself away here, in the crystal cavern, where nobody else could find her. Her dreams of Sephiroth were also caused by the Genova cells inside her. The reunion. As Sephiroth called out from the livestream to all those bearing Genova cells, he also woke Lucretia from her long sleep. Only the crystal protected her, and so she believed that her visions of him were simply dreams. And it was lucky for her that she did. To see what her son had become, and the things that he had done. Vincent was thankful she had been spared that pain, at least. Now it was up to him and his friends to make sure that those dreams ended. With that thought firmly in his mind, Vincent turned and walked out of the cavern. He did not look back. He couldn't not until he confronted Professor Hojo and made him pay for what he had done to Lucretia. Only then would he come back here to see Lucretia again. The others waited a moment before following him. They were startled by what they had just seen, but were also a little disappointed, for this meant that the key was not here after all. They would have to come up with something else. Cloud was the last to leave. He stopped at the entrance and took one last look at the crystal where Lucretia slept. So this was Lucretia, the woman that Vincent had loved, and the woman who had given birth to Sephiroth. Yet it was Genova whom Sephiroth claimed as his mother, not Lucretia. That was thanks to the Genova cells that had been implanted into both Lucretia and Sephiroth, before his birth. Cloud had to wonder. Did Sephiroth even know about Lucretia? Or had her name been carefully stricken from the records, as was Shinra's way? He heard Tifa's voice, calling his name. Cloud turned from the crystal and ran down the tunnel to catch up to his friends. It did not matter who Sephiroth's parents were. In fact, seeing Lucretia only gave them another reason to find him and stop him from doing harm to anybody else. The others were waiting for him by the cave entrance. Vincent stood a little ways apart from them, looking out at the valley that surrounded the cave. He looked troubled and deep in thought, but that was not surprising considering what he had just seen. Until now, he had believed Lucretia to be dead. Many thoughts were likely running through his head right now. It was probably a good idea to leave Vincent alone for a while, and let him sort out his feelings by himself. Cloud walked forward and gave Vincent a pat on the shoulder before he headed off along the shore, back to where they had docked the sub. Vincent looked at Cloud as he walked away, before he gave a slight nod of his head and followed him. The sub was just as they had left it, although it had attracted a few feathery friends that sat perched on top of it. They chased the birds away and reluctantly climbed back inside the sub. They were more than a little subdued when they took their seats on the bridge, because they had yet to find any clues to the whereabouts of the key, and also because they already missed the warmth of the sunlight. Once Cloud had submerged the sub and guided it back into the dark tunnel, Sid spoke out.
Well, that sure was a waste of time,
he moaned.
Not even a key.
He leaned against the wall, pulled out a cigarette.
So where next?
No one answered right away. They all looked at the floor, waiting for someone to come up with an answer. Cloud sighed heavily. It was true, they had come all this way across the ocean, and they had found no clues as to where the key might be. He wished they'd had a chance to ask Lucretia, but that was impossible now. It really did seem that they had come all this way for nothing. Katshi was sitting on the edge of the console beside Sid. He drummed his fingers lightly on the side of his megaphone and tilted his head left to right. Finally, he nodded his head and looked up.
Well,
he began, a little hesitantly.
I don't know where we might go to look next. But since we're down here. I knew it.
Cloud brought the sub to a stop in the middle of the tunnel and turned his chair around to face the cat. His eyes narrowed.
I knew there was another reason you wanted us to come all this way. It had nothing to do with the cave. That's not true.
The cat protested, looking hurt.
I really did think there might be a clue there. It's just that while we're here, there is a place I'd really like to check out. You see, I heard that one of our airships crashed and sank somewhere near here, and I just wanted to see if that was true. Just your general curiosity?
Asked Barrett, skeptical.
Curiosity killed the cat, you know,
said Yuffie, fiddling with her boot. Sid rubbed his temple.
It's killin' me, and I ain't no cat.
He grumbled.
Curiosity aside, I think it might be worth us checking out,
Cat insisted.
Remember, this is a Shinra airship. And I heard Scarlet had put some special items on that airship. We might be able to find something that we can put to use.
Everybody on the sub looked at Cloud, waiting for his decision. Seeing that it was going to be him who made this decision, Cloud sighed again. He wanted to go back to the Forgotten City, to see if Bugenhagen had managed to translate any more of the ancients' writing. That would mean going all the way back to the eastern continent and getting back on their airship. They would be wasting more valuable time just traveling. Also, as much as he hated to admit it, Cat had piqued his curiosity about the sunken airship. It would be a very great shame if they were to leave behind anything that could help them in the fights that were to come ahead. It would be more of a shame if Shinra were to retrieve them and use them against Cloud and the others. Cloud ran a hand through his hair and tugged the end of one of his spikes. It would be wasting more time, he thought, but if there was anything that could help them it would be worth the risk. Curiosity killed the cat.
We'll check out the airship,
he answered finally. Cat jumped for joy.
But we'll just take a quick look. If we can't find anything useful, we leave and go back to the Forgotten City.
He looked at the jumping cat.
I assume you know where the airship sank?
He asked. Cat stopped jumping and nodded.
All right, then. Let's go.
The others nodded. If Cloud thought it was okay to check out the airship, then they did, too. Cat jumped off the console and climbed up onto his Mog, smiling broadly.
You won't regret it, Cloud,
he said.
I promise you.
Cloud really hoped that he wouldn't. End of chapter.